Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to build a Markdown previewer. This is another project that is given or that is available on the website FREECODECAMP.org. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this website, this is one of the most prolific websites in the world that helps people learn how to code, and it's basically free of charge. And the way they help people or they teach people how to code is that they have a bunch of certification courses, and in each certification course they have lots of lessons that you need to complete. And then at the end of the certification, there are several projects that you need to complete as well in order to earn that certification. So that's some background on where on freecodecamp.org, and obviously where this project, this app idea is coming from. And this specific app or this specific project is part of the certification called Front-End Development Libraries. Okay. So that is the actual certification course of which this app is part of. So in other words, if you want to complete front-end libraries, you got to go through the lessons and several projects. One of those projects is the Markdown previewer. But hopefully you're already aware of this, because hopefully that's why this video was of interest to you. Okay. Now, in this video, I'm going to build the Markdown previewer from scratch. I'm going to build all aspects of it, and I'm going to do it in about, I don't know, 6 to 7 steps. So let me outline the steps that I'm going to, the steps I'm going to do. Okay. So step number one, I'm going to obviously review the requirements, right? Because you need to know, you need to know what to code, what to build. So there's no better way to know that other than reviewing and knowing the requirements. Number two, I'm going to review the mockup. Okay. Now clearly this is a end user app. So clearly there are end user or UI elements. So we will take a look at that. In fact, I'm going to not just review the mockup, I'm going to review a working version of this app done by someone else, so that not only can I show you the UI elements, but also how the app needs to work once we do build it, once we do complete it, right? But don't worry about the working version. We are going to build this app from scratch in this video, as I said before. All right. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking or giving you an overview of what is a overview of Markdown, like what is Markdown and what is the marked parser. Okay, these are important elements or concepts or things that we need to know about. Now hopefully you are already aware of this, but if not, I will spend a few minutes giving you some background on what is Markdown and what is a marked parser. Okay. All right, and then we're going to actually start coding things up. So then I will create the HTML, okay, and CSS, following which we will code the app using JavaScript, but mostly jQuery, right? Then I will run the automated tests. These automated tests are available on the same site, freecodecamp.org, and we'll run the automated tests just to make sure that whatever we have built, passes, and whatever we have built is exactly as per requirements, right? And finally, I'll give you a walkthrough of my GitHub repository. All right, so you can know where I have stored all the coding artifacts. So whatever I develop in this video, I will post it on my GitHub repository, and then you can do with it what you will. All right. Okay, so that's what it is, guys. So that's the roadmap of this video. So with that, let's oh, by the way, one more thing, a quick note on prerequisites before I jump on to step number one. So as I mentioned in my previous videos, right, you need to have some level of familiarity with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and also jQuery, right? Clearly this is not a tutorial video. This is not a tutorial on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and in order for you to keep pace with what I'm going to be coding, what I'm going to be building in this video, it'll be really helpful if you have some level of familiarity with these topics. Okay. So great. Again, that's what the roadmap looks like of what I'm going to be doing in this video. So with that, let's jump into step number 1, which is review of the requirements. So I will take you directly to the requirements page, which is right here. All right. This is the requirements page for this app, which is right off of the FREECODECAMP website, as you can see. The first whole paragraph is very boilerplate. There's nothing to read here. You can read it on your own time. It basically says that, hey, these are the requirements, and hey, you can use HTML, JavaScript, CSS, Bootstrap, Sass, React, Redux, and jQuery to complete this project. That's basically the gist of the first few lines. Let's jump right into reviewing the requirements so we can save some time. So, they call the requirements as user stories. So user story 1 or requirement 1 states that I can see a text area element with a corresponding ID of editor, or ID equals editor. So what this requirement is saying is that, hey, you gotta have a text area element. As you know, HTML text area is an HTML element where you can input stuff, where user can input stuff. So they need one of those, and they need that to have a specific ID of editor. Requirement number 2, I can see an element with a corresponding ID equals preview. So what this is saying is, again, pretty straightforward. They're saying that, hey, you gotta have another element, and that element, can be anything, right? Can be section, can be, div, can be a p element, any element, any hopefully block level element, and that element must have an ID of preview. Okay. Number 3, requirement number 3, when I enter text into the editor, into the hash editor element, the hash preview element is updated as I type to display the content of the text area. So this is a very key part of the functionality of this app. So pay attention here. What this requirement number 3 is saying is that, hey, whenever you enter any text, whenever you type into that hash editor element, as you may remember from here, hash editor is that text area element, right? Whenever you type in the text area element, the other element whose ID is preview must get updated. Its content must get updated as you type in the text area element. Okay. Next, number 4, when I enter GitHub flavored Markdown into the hash editor element, the text is required, or rather, the text is rendered as HTML in the hash preview element as I type. Hint, you don't need to parse the Markdown yourself. You can import the marked library for this from this URL. All right, so let me open up this URL. All right, and I'm going to give you a explanation of this, what this requirement is. So this is the URL that they are presented, and we will refer to that in a minute. But what this requirement number 4 is saying is pretty important, is basically the heart of this app. What this is saying is that, hey, whenever you type anything in the text area element, whatever text you type in the text area element, the element which has the ID of editor, it should get converted into the appropriate HTML. And that HTML should get displayed in the other element whose ID is preview. So that's what this requirement is saying. In other words, this requirement, as I just said, is sort of the key piece of this app, right? Because in this app, what we will be doing, as I will show you when we review the markup, is that you will type something in the text area element, and that whatever you type must get interpreted or parsed by some JavaScript utility called the parser, and then it should also get, after it's parsed, after it's converted into the appropriate HTML, that HTML should get rendered in the other element whose ID is preview, right? So that's what this requirement number 4 is talking about, and this goes to the heart of the functionality for this app. Right, number 5, when my Markdown preview first loads, the default text in the editor field should contain valid Markdown that presents at least one of each of the following elements: a heading element, h1 size, a subheading element, h2 size, a link, inline code, a code block, a list item, a block quote, an image, and bolded text. So what this requirement number 5 is saying is that, hey, whenever you load the app, the page that contains the app, right? Because once we code the whole thing up, basically you'll have a website, a web page where this app will be available, the UI will be available for the user to basically do stuff. On that page, every time you load it, there should be some default text present in the editor element. And what should that default text contain? Well, it should contain all of this stuff, right? H1, H2, etc., etc. Right. Moving right along, number 6, when my Markdown previewer first loads, the default Markdown in the hash editor field should be rendered as HTML in the preview element. So again, this is connected, this is related to requirement number 5, right? This is saying is that, hey, whatever default text you have in the editor element, meaning in the text area element, well, that default text should be appropriately converted, or should be appropriately interpreted and rendered in the preview element. So again, this is basically saying that every time you load the page, if I combine requirement 5 and 6, if I summarize requirements 5 and 6 for you, this is basically saying, defining the behavior of the app on page load. So what requirements 5 and 6 are saying is that, hey, every time you load the page, there should be some default text containing a bunch of items in the text area element, and its corresponding representation, its corresponding HTML elements should also be rendered and displayed in the preview element. So that's what requirements 5 and 6 are talking about. Okay. And finally, it says optional bonus. You do not need to make this test pass. My Markdown previewer interprets carriage returns and renders them as BR, line break elements. Okay. So what this is saying is that, hey, your Markdown previewer should be able to also interpret carriage returns, right? So whenever there is a carriage return in the text area element, right, because that's where you are able to type, it should get converted as a BR element, a line break HTML element, and rendered in the preview element. All right. So even though it says optional bonus, I will code this so that you get additional practice or additional knowledge or know-how as to how to make these types of requirements to work. All right. So that's our review of the requirements, guys, and hopefully that helped. Below here is just, it tells you the template to use. So it's something we will. So basically it tells you that, hey, you can go here, right? You can go here and you can code your template here. You can put the code of this when you finish coding this project. This is where you can go, and this is where you can basically put your code and see if it passes or not. All right. So this is what it is. These are just this is where once we finish our coding, we will go and we will put our code. Okay. All right. So that's basically a review of the requirements. So with that, let's move on to step number 2, where we will review the markup, right? That's our step number 2. We finished number 1. Let's review the markup. And as I said, right, for the markup, I'm going to actually review a working version of this code, and that is available, I believe that's available here. So let me open that up. Okay. And while it comes up, so here it is. All right. So this is the UI that we need to achieve, that we need to code for, right? So basically, in terms of our UI, first let me describe the UI elements, and then I'll show you how this app actually works. I'll show you the functionality as well. But let me start by describing to you the UI elements. All right. So basically, it should have two such, I would say, two such boxes, right? Let's talk about the box with this title editor, which has editor here, right? This box, basically, this box should contain a bunch of elements on the top. So maybe we can think of it as some sort of a header, which has this sort of, greenish, I don't know the exact color. I don't know if it's green or teal. I'm not very good at recognizing colors. So please excuse me if I'm wrong. But basically, if I describe this box, it contains of two major parts. One is this heading type container, which has all of this stuff. And the other is this text box, right? That's what it is. So in terms of UI elements, you have, the editor box. Let me just call it the editor box or the editor pane. This editor pane has two major types of elements going on here. First, there is this heading element. Inside the heading element, what do you have? You have this logo, you have this text editor, and you have button. All right, button with an icon. All right, and then you have this text area element. Remember, our requirements clearly specified that we need a text area element. So that's the first part of the requirement. And below, you have a very similar structure, but there's only a couple of differences, right? The below here also is a very similar structure to the editor box or the editor pane, right? I'm going to call this the previewer box. This whole structure below, this whole structure below, I'm going to call it previewer box or previewer pane. It also contains some sort of a some sort of a header element which has the same logo, the text previewer, and a button here. Okay, actually there are two buttons here which I will show in a minute, but there's buttons here, and then below you have some big container with a light grayish background, and that container basically has all this rendered text. So that is basically what we need to implement in terms of UI elements, right? One quick thing, there is an additional button here, and let me describe to you how, where is that additional button, right? You can see just one button right now, but there's actually two buttons here, right? And that other button will become visible if you click on it. So when I click on it, let's see what happens. You see what happens? When I click on it, the entire web page gets occupied by the editor pane or the editor box, and the expand button disappears, and in its place you have the compress button. This is known as the compress icon button, and the button before that you saw was the expand icon button. So that's what happens here. When you click on the expand icon button, below the previewer box disappears, the entire page is occupied by the editor box, and this expand button disappears, and in its place you see the compress button. Now let's see what happens when I click the compress button. When I click the compress button, voila, everything appears as it was before, meaning both boxes appear with both the expand buttons, right? Let's do the same with the previewer button and with the expand button in the previewer box and see what functionality to expect. Well, with the same functionality, when I click on this button, the editor box will disappear and the entire page will be occupied by the previewer button like this. There you go. See, there is no editor box. The entire page is occupied by the previewer box, right? And the expand button has also disappeared, and in its place has appeared the compress icon button. And when you click the compress icon button, voila, you have both the elements reappear back again, occupying roughly half of the page. All right, so that is the functionality that I wanted to show you. That is, that is part of the app that I would like to build. And with that, there are two buttons here, right? But basically the structure of both these, the editor box and the previewer box below and the editor box above, they are more or less the same with a couple of differences. For example, this white area is a text area. It's an input element. This here is not a text area. This text here says editor, this text here says previewer, and this has shorter width than this. Those are the only differences. Other than that, the UI elements are pretty much, these two elements are pretty much alike. Okay, now let me show you the core central functionality of this app. Right, remember, this has to do with all the requirements that most of the requirements that we talked about here. Remember, requirements number 3 says that you can type into the text area, right? So let's see if we can type into the text area. Right, I'm going to type something here, and yes, I can type in, right? I can type in. I have typed something, let's say Sanjeet, or some garbage gibberish word. Okay, or let me type in this is a project. Okay, and look what happened here. Look what happened here. The same as I was typing simultaneously in the previewer pane, the same text appeared, right? Let me keep typing here. Say, let me say something like, I am going to code this project. And notice, as I'm typing, whatever I'm typing up in the text area is simultaneously appearing here. So that's one key piece of functionality that requirement number 3 and 4 were talking about, right? Well, they were also talking about something else. They were talking about Markdown. Well, what is Markdown? Markdown is basically a simple, lightweight markup language. It's like a simplified version of HTML, where if you use some special characters, they get converted into specific HTML elements. So let me delete this line that I just coded, okay? And let me describe to you what I mean. So if I use a hash sign and give it a space, and whatever I type now, that text will get converted into an H1 element, okay? So let me type, say this is an H1 element, and look what happened. It's no longer small text. We have a text, whatever I typed here got converted into an H1 tag, and that is what a Markdown previewer does, right? Whatever you type here, if you precede it with some special keys or special characters, right, they will get converted into corresponding elements, corresponding HTML elements. All right, so let me try something else. Let's try a double hash sign. If I try double hash sign, double hash also has a special meaning in the Markdown language. Okay, double hash means a H2 element. So I'm going to type now, this is an H2 tag, and look, this got converted into an I'm sorry, I put H1, forgive me here, H2 tag. Now look at this. This also got converted into an H2 tag, right, as expected. And H2 tag and H1 tag, you can tell this is an H2 tag because it's smaller in size than the H1 element above, right? So that is what Markdown does. Now, if you want to know more about Markdown, you can basically Google Markdown here. You can do Markdown cheat sheet. You can Google Markdown cheat sheet, and you will come to this page, or you can select this page from one of the search results. This gives you an overview of what Markdown is. So what is Markdown? Markdown is a lightweight markup language, right? And you use that to add formatting to elements, to plain text, right? So basically, if you have a plain text document, if you use some special characters, you can convert that into HTML elements, right? This was, again, there's some more information here created by John Gruber in 2004. You know, that's not important from the part of the project, but basically what this project is saying is this Markdown, what Markdown is, the key thing that you have to home in on when you read this page is, if you don't know, is what is Markdown? Markdown is just a lightweight markup language. So basically, this language defines certain special keys, certain special characters. If you use those characters, give and then write some text after those characters, they will get converted into HTML, appropriate HTML elements. That's what a Markdown does. Okay, that's what you mean by a markup language, right? There are some special characters. If you use those special characters, and then anything you write after those special characters gets converted into corresponding HTML elements, right? So what are those special characters, right? This may be a question in your mind that, hey, how do I know what are those special characters? Well, I also already showed you two of them, right? I already showed you, if you use a single hash, you get an H1 element. If you use a double hash, space and text, that text gets converted into a H2 tag. Let me keep going. If I use a triple hash, give it a space, this should, any text I write here should get converted into an H3 element. So this is an H3 element, right? And look here, it got converted to, and again I made a mistake, I should put 3 here. So this is an H3 element, and look, this text got converted into H3. Why did it get converted into H3? Because I used 3 hash signs before it, right? And you can see that the size of this element is different from the size of an H2 and different from the size of an H1. So the point is, there are many, okay, there are many special sort of characters that trigger the Markdown, right? That are part of the Markdown syntax, if you will. Now, what are those characters? You can go to the cheat sheet right here. If you go to the cheat sheet, right? And this shows you all the basic syntax of a Markdown language, right? As it says right here under basic syntax heading, these are the elements outlined in John Gruber's original design document. All Markdown applications support these elements, right? So if you want a heading, you start with a hash followed by space and whatever text. If you want a heading 2, double hash, space and whatever. If you want a heading 3, you give 3 hashes together, space and whatever text, right? What about bold? If you want a bold text, how do you do that? You surround the text that you want to be bolded in 2 stars. 2 stars on the left, 2 asterisk signs on the left and 2 asterisk sign on the right. What about italicizing? If you want to italicize text, you surround that italicized text with an asterisk sign each on each side. What about block quote? Block quote is again an HTML element that you use if you're citing. If you're quoting someone, if you're quoting or using text or using something from another website, you can use the block quote HTML element. Feel free to read up on it if you want more details. How do you create how do you indicate a block quote in your text? If you want it to be marked down, you use a single arrow, right? And similarly, there's other stuff here, right? There's stuff for unordered lists, for ordered lists, for code. If you want to display code, you surround that code within 2 backticks, right? That's how you will, so in other words, a a markdown language, basically this is the syntax defined, right? And on and on. If you want to link, if you want to display a link, a URL as a link on your in your document, how do you what would be the markdown syntax? You would write the name of whatever you are that would be visible, and here is where you would provide the actual URL. All right. And below here, there's some extended syntax you can review, right? That tells you what are the others. So it's lightweight, but it has many options. So for example, you can, you know how to create a table. What's the syntax? What's the markdown syntax to create a table? What's the markdown syntax to create a footnote? So feel free to review this, but this is the markdown syntax that is used in all markdown parsers that are created. So we're gonna be creating a markdown app, obviously, and this is the syntax that we will follow. All right, and if you go back to our page, you will notice here, right? Look, there's this thing is within 2 backticks. Okay, let me delete the stuff that I typed so that it becomes cleaner. Okay, now if you look at these two, right, there's 2 backticks here. 2 backticks. Any text within 2 backticks, according to Markdown, gets converted into this type of a thing. It gets converted into code, right? So those are the things that Markdown syntax or the Markdown language allows for. Now, here's the next question, right? Well, who's doing the conversion? So when I type here a single hash followed by space and I say this is an H1 element, who is doing this conversion? That may be a question in your mind. Well, that conversion is being done by a JavaScript utility or a JavaScript plugin, and that's what our requirement was referring to. Remember, a requirement said, hey, if you go here, hint, right, requirement number, which requirement was it? It was requirement number 4, I believe, right? Hint, you don't need to parse Markdown yourself. You can import the mark library for this. This is a key piece of information, right? This is saying that, hey, you don't have to do the conversion. So this conversion that is happening every time you type something in appropriate Markdown syntax, it gets converted, right? It gets converted. That conversion, you don't have to write the code for the conversion. You just have to write the code for display, right? That's the key focus of the project. The main code that the project wants us to write is basically to display whatever user types here, as long as it has a appropriate Markdown, whatever the user is typing here, it should get displayed or rendered below. That is the focus of the project. The project is not expecting you to write the conversion mechanism. It is only asking you to write code for the display or the rendering mechanism, right? That is the key differentiation that I hope you have realized by review of the requirements, right? So clearly we need some code to convert, to do the conversion. So every time I write a hash, right, there should be some code that goes, oh, I have a hash here, so I need to convert this into an H1, like so, right? Every time I write some other syntax like a double hash, right, there should be some code that goes, oh, the user has typed double hash. That means whatever is going to come next, I need to convert into an H2 element, right? So there needs to be some code that does the conversion, right? That does the parsing, that does the interpretation. And that's what this requirement is saying, that, hey, hint, you don't need to parse the Markdown yourself, meaning, hey, you don't have to write the Markdown parser yourself. You can import it or use the one provided here. And I open this page here, and look here. This is basically just a regular CDN which is hosting the actual JavaScript utility or the JavaScript plugin, right? Look here, there's 2 of them here. There's the minified version here, right? The smaller version, and there's a full version. You can use any one of them, right? And they have also made it convenient for you to copy the script tag. So if you want to copy the script tag, which I will do, right? You can also copy the URL, by the way, and create your own script tag and put the URL in the source attribute. But why do all the work when the script tag when the mechanism is available to copy the whole script tag directly? So that is what you can do, is either choose this one or this one and just click on this button, copy script tag, and when we actually start creating our HTML, right, we will need to put this script tag in the head section as always. All right, now to be honest with you, I'm going to use a different marked parser, right? This is what the project site is recommending, and you can use it. I have used it in a previous implementation, but in this implementation I'm going to be using the original marked parser, right, which is or I'm going to be using the same marked parser hosted off of a different CDN. So let me correct that. I'm not using a different marked parser. I'm using the same marked parser. Look at the marked parser name. It's marked.min.js, right? This is the minified or the minimal, the smaller version, and the name is marked.js. Well, this is created, I believe. I'm going to take you to the site where the original documentation for this parser is present, and that is this site here, right? If you just type marked.js, so for example, if you just type marked.js.org, it'll take you to this site. I just want to show you how to get to it, instead of simply just taking you to the page, instead of just navigating to the tab. So if you just type in your browser, in your address bar, in your search bar, marked.js.org, you'll come to this page. This is the page this is the site that has the documentation for the marked parser. So this parser here, right, this is just a hosting site. This is just a CDN. If you want to see what the parser can do and all related information, you can go here, the marked documentation page. This page also gives you a CDN right here. And this is what I mean. Under installation, under usage, it gives you this script tag. And this is what I was talking to you about. I'm going to be using this script tag instead of this one. Again, both of them are exactly the same. They are exactly the same. It is the same JavaScript plugin, but they are hosted off of a different URL. So if you look here, right, this is hosted off of this URL, right? And the one that is provided by the requirements is hosted off of a different URL. That's the only difference. Otherwise, the files are exactly the same. All right, and so that's what I will be using in order for, in order to basically utilize the parser. Remember, once again, why do we need the parser? We need the parser so that somebody does the conversion. Remember, somebody has to convert. Every time you write some markdown syntax, it has to get converted, right? As the project site is saying, as the requirements are saying clearly, you don't need to parse markdown yourself, meaning you don't have to write the code for the markdown, for the parser. The code that you have to write is for the rendering, meaning every time I type here, right? Every time I type here, right? So for example, I'm typing here. I'm not going to use any syntax. I'm just going to type something, right? I am typing some random stuff. Okay, every time I write it, now this is not preceded by any markdown syntax, so it gets rendered exactly as it is down here. All right, and the reason is I have not preceded this with any markdown syntax. There's no hash, there's no backtick, there's no asterisk, there's no any of the other valid markdown syntax. So it gets rendered exactly as it is right here, right? So that is, again, as I repeated a few minutes ago, the purpose of the project is not for you or me to write the markdown parser. That is already available online. We just have to use it. We have to write the code for rendering of using the markdown parser and rendering it here. Okay. All right. So this is the goal. So as I said, in order to do that, I will use the marked parser. Anybody who is doing this project has to utilize the marked parser or the markdown parser that is available online. And the way to do that is you basically take the script tag here, right? This script tag, and you include it in your HTML. Okay. All right, so that covers, hopefully that helped, guys. I know that was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to provide as many details as I could because I don't know the level of the folks of the people that are going to watch this video. I try to cover the lowest common denominator, and hence I had to basically go into a little more detail than I had originally planned to. So we are done with steps 1, 2, and 3. All right, let's now start creating our HTML. All right, so I am in my code editor, VS Code. As you may have noticed from the previous videos in the playlist, I use VS Code. It's one of the most popular code editors out there by Microsoft, and it's available for free. And so what I've done so far before I started the video is I just created the files that I would need to code into, right? So I have an index.html file, as you can see, right? I have the styles.css, right? and I also have the JavaScript file. Right, that's all I did just to save a little bit of time, is create these files. As you can see, these are empty, so I'm going to code here from scratch. Right, so now let's start creating our HTML, and I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit because, as I mentioned, right, I do expect some level of familiarity from folks who are watching this video in HTML, CSS, right? And that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to try to give comments where I feel, but it'll be sort of, I'll try to be as brief as possible. All right, so I'm going to, create the, right at the HTML tag, HTML5 tag, which is doc.html. Then I'm going to create the HTML tags. Okay, then I'll create the head tags, and I'll then create the body tag. So this is basically all I've done is put together the skeletal tag structure that is pretty much common in any HTML document. Let's now try to fill out our head tag. Let's try to add within the head section all the stuff that we would need. So first of all, as is customary, I'll add a title tag, and I'll give it a text of a Markdown previewer. Okay. Next, let me add the link tag for my style sheet, which is this file, styles.css. That, as you know, needs to be added as a link tag, and with attributes such as rel, which should say style sheet. Okay, and type text that's /css, and href attribute should give the location of the file. Since my index.html and my styles.css are in the same folder, I just have to name the file. I don't have to give any path. That's the advantage of putting all your files in the same folder. All right, so that's my link tag. All right, the next thing that I want to put here is my jQuery, link to a jQuery. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'll be using mostly jQuery. And as you know, in order to use jQuery, you have to either include the entire jQuery source code and give a script tag here, which has a path to the entire jQuery source code, which you have to download onto your local machine. Or, as most people do, you can just include a script tag which points to a jQuery CDN. This is much more preferable, and this is much more convenient, so I'm just going to include a link to the jQuery CDN. So let's look it up here. I'm just going to say Google jQuery CDN, and the very first result is for the hosted libraries page from Google. You go in there and you just have to copy this script tag. That's all. They make it super convenient. All I have to do is copy the script tag and bring it back to here and put it in my head, within my head tags, within my head section. All right, so now I have a link to the latest and greatest jQuery source code. All right, the next thing that I want to put here is let's see, I need one more thing that I want to mention that I didn't mention, and this is relevant now, so let me talk about it now. When I did this project, obviously I've done this project in the past, so just to try it out to make sure it works. What I've found is that if I include a link tag to the Bootstrap CSS, the font and the look and feel, the viewing of the page becomes much more viewer friendly, much more easy to read, right? So that's why what I'm going to do is I'm just going to include a link tag, another link tag to the Bootstrap CSS. So let me just do that here. I'm just going to say Bootstrap CSS link. Okay, and you can get that directly from getbootstrap.com if you click on the very first link. All right, and you go down here. This is the link that I'm talking about here, right? If you notice this thing, right, it is basically your Bootstrap link. Okay. Again, I noticed this while I did this project previously. What I found that when I included this Bootstrap link tag, okay, I found that it was much more viewer friendly, and you will see what I mean when we actually see the page. You will see what I mean. So let me just copy this here and go in here and put this script tag right here. Okay, now the flip side is if you don't use it, that is totally okay too. if you don't want to use the link tag, you will still be able to code and successfully complete this project. I want to be clear about that. This is by no means a mandatory dependency that I'm adding. This is just a dependency that I noticed. It basically, like I said, it spruces up, right? It polishes up the fonts and the spacing and whatnot of the rendered part, right? So when I say the rendered part, I mean this is what I mean, right? So the stuff here in the previewer, that the font and the lettering and whatnot gets a bit more spruced up, gets a bit more polished when I add the Bootstrap CSS link tag that I just added, right? But again, if you don't want to add it, that's totally cool. Once again, you should still be able to successfully code and complete the project. In fact, the very code that I write will work even without the link tag. Now, I haven't figured out yet why the link tag spruces up the spacing and the lettering and all that. If you know, please I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment. But that's just been my anecdotal experience, so I'm adding this link tag here. Okay. All right. So with that, the next thing that I need to add is, let's see. Oh, I need to add the marked parser, right? Remember, in the beginning of the video, I spent some time giving you an overview of the what is a Markdown previewer and how a Markdown previewer needs a parser, right? Which is basically a JavaScript plugin, a JavaScript utility, right? Basically JavaScript code that parses, right? Any text that contains Markdown syntax, it parses it and converts it into HTML elements, right? That code is something that as I explained earlier in the earlier part of the video, we don't have to write that. We can just use it. And I took you to the web page here, right? Right here. So, and I explained to you that I'm going to be using this script tag, right? Once again, you can use this script tag that the project site recommends. This would work perfectly. This is the same file. If you look at the file name, it's exactly the same, but I just prefer to use a different CDN, right? I have done the project with the other CDN. Again, it works just fine. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to include this here. Obviously, you have to include a path. You have to include the marked parser, because without it, the project will not work, because it will not do the interpretation. It will not convert the Markdown syntax into HTML. And I hope I have made that clear by now by discussing that point a couple of times. All right. And finally, let me also include my script tag. So I will be writing code in this file script.js, right? So obviously I need to include that. So I'm going to include the script tag like so. So I'll open the script tag, put type equals text dash JavaScript. And I also need to put the source tag, which will simply be the name of my script file, which is script.js. And again, this is because all my files, index.html, styles.css, and script.js are in the same folder, so I don't have to mess with relative paths and whatnot, right? We're almost done with the head section. One last thing that I need to include is the fontawesome. Path, the fontawesome link tag, right? So as you may have seen from my previous videos, I use fontawesome icons, and as I explained when I was reviewing the mockup, right, we need icons because of these buttons. Remember these things, right? These arrows. This is known as a expand icon, right? This expand icon so obviously this is a button, but the button contains an expand icon, right? And when you click the button, as I showed you, the expand button disappears and we get a compress button. Now again, this is a button, but this thing inside is a icon, and that is known as a compressed icon, right? So we need icons. This is the point I'm trying to make, and as you have seen from my previous videos, I like to use fontawesome icons, and in order to use fontawesome icons, you have to include a fontawesome script tag in your head section, right? So again, you know how to get it. I have explained that in my previous videos. If you don't have fontawesome, you just go and if you want to use fontawesome fontawesome icons, you simply go navigate to fontawesome.com, okay? And once you're there, you click on this start for free. Once you click on that, it'll take you to a page where you enter your email address here, okay? And you hit this button, send code, and you will get an email with the script tag, That script tag is free, and that will allow you to use many FontAwesome icons. The folks over at FontAwesome are very generous. Even with the free version, you can use like literally tons of icons, right? So that's how you would get that. Now I have my own script tag, obviously, so I'm not going to enter my email address here. So I'm just going to get that. I'm just going to get the FontAwesome script tag right here. Okay. So this is my script tag. I'm just going to come in here, and I'm going to include it. Let's say I'm just going to put it here. Okay. All right. So I've included the FontAwesome script tag, and with this, I will be able to use many of the FontAwesome icons. All right. So let me just start creating our HTML elements. Right now, again, to refresh your memory, we want to create. I want to create two big boxes, right? So as I mentioned while I was reviewing the mockup and this page, this UI basically comprises of this editor box, right? This editor pane, and the previewer box or previewer pane, whatever you want to call it. And each of them has a very similar structure. So the editor box has this sort of a thin, like you can call it a header, and which has 4 elements. It has the logo, it has the text editor, and it has 2 buttons. Obviously only one is visible, and I've explained to you why. The other one gets visible once you click on it, right? But we have to code for both buttons, with each button having its own icon. So basically this whole editor box, right, comprises of this header, and this header comprises of 4 elements: the logo, the text editor, and 2 buttons, each with its own icon. And below the header is this text area box, this whitish box. That is a text area element, right? And it has to be a text area element because the requirement spells it out, because you need an element which you can write stuff in. And in HTML, text area is the most popular element that you can write free form text, right? So again, this is clearly indicated in the requirements. So this whitish part has to be a text area with a specific ID called editor, right? So let's first build out this whole editor pane. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to encompass everything in a main container, right? Main container. I can just give it an ID of container. Okay, this will be my container that contains everything. All right. Within that, I'm going to create, like I said, the editor pane, and the way I'm going to create that is I'm going to use an article, and this article will basically house the whole editor, the editor box. I'm going to give this article an ID. I'm going to call it editor pane, right? So editor pane. Again, this is the entire, my plan is to use this article to basically house this whole editor box, in which includes the header with its stuff and this text box, or the text area, text area element, right? Now within that, I'm going to create the header. Okay, I'm going to give it an ID of editor-header. Okay. I'm going to give it, I'm sorry, I just need to give it a closing single quote. Okay, and within the header, as I mentioned, we need 4 elements. We need that logo, and the logo is also available as an icon from FontAwesome. That logo is basically a FREECODECAMP logo. So let me first look for it here. All right, I'm going to go to the search bar. I'm just going to look for FontAwesome FREECODECAMP icon. Let's see what comes up. And all right, there's a recommendation, and I clicked on the recommendation, and the very first search result should basically give us that logo that we need. Let's see if it comes up, and it's just taking a second. And yeah, there it is, FREECODECAMP logo. Look at this logo. It looks like, that's what we have here, right? If you look here, this is what we have. Obviously, this is much smaller, so hopefully you're able to make out. But this logo, which is the same here, is basically this logo. So I'm just going to copy this here. And FontAwesome folks make it very easy to add their icon. As you know, FontAwesome icons come with their own tag. All you got to do is copy this here and add it to your HTML. So I'm just going to add it here. and that should add our font awesome logo, and we'll check all that in a minute. But let's keep coding our HTML so as we can add some more elements before we go to the web page and actually start seeing it. The next is the text editor, right? Is the word editor in there? So I'm going to add it inside a span element. All right, so I'm just going to say editor here within span element. Okay, then we have inside the span element, right? Now what I'm going to do is okay, let's do that. Now let me also add the two buttons. Okay, so I'm going to add a button. I'm going to give it an ID of, let's say, I'm going to give e-expand. Okay, short for editor expand button. I'm just going to make it a short sort of abbreviated ID, e-exp. All right, and this is the button, and inside the button, as you know, we need an icon. So in this button, I will put the expand icon. So let me grab the expand icon. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to search for font awesome expand icon. Okay, and in the expand icon, I will just click on the very first search result. That should take me to what I need. Let's see here. Yep, that's what I needed. So I'm just going to copy this and bring it over here, and I'm going to paste this in the middle. So this should bring up my, when we look at the page, we should have the expand icon here. And then I need another button. Like I said, there's two buttons in each header, right? The other button should be for the compress function. I'm going to give this an ID of e-com, which is short for e-compress. And I'm going to now get the font awesome compress icon. Let's see what comes up. Let's see. Well, let's check the first one. Typically, all right. This will work, but this has a sort of a this additional attribute of area dash hidden. I don't like to use it, but I think it'll work too. So let me see what is the next search result. What kind of icon do we get when I click on the next search result for the font awesome compress? Yep, and this is what I prefer because this I tag is simpler. So let me copy that, bring that over here, paste it here. All right, so now we have our basically we have created most of our editor pane or editor box. The only thing that I need to create is the text area. So let me create that here, and obviously the text area is below the header, so I'm going to go below the header and I'm going to say text area. I'm going to give it an ID of editor, and this ID has to be editor because that's what the requirements spell out clearly, right? The requirements have this expectation that the text area element must have an ID of editor, right? So in other words, all these other elements, right? These elements that I just added, the main, the article, the header, and the button, you can choose whatever ID you want to give these elements because the project does not expect any specific ID for those elements. So you can choose whatever you want. But when it comes to the text area, the requirements are very specific, and they do expect that A, there has to be a text area element, and B, that text area element must have this ID of editor. So here we don't have any wiggle room. We have to use editor, right? So we have this now. Okay, now, so I think we have put all our elements for the editor pane. Let's see how it's shaping up. So I'm going to go to my browser. I'm going to go to this page. All right, I'm going to refresh it. Okay, so we have all the elements. Look, we have the logo, we have the text editor, we have these two buttons, and we have the text area. But obviously this is all squished up and little and really tiny, first of all, and all squished up and all to the left top corner. That's not what we want. We want the editor pane or the editor box to basically look like this, occupy a nice big space in the middle, right? So why is ours looking like this? Well, the answer is clear. We have not added any styling. So let's do that. Let's add some CSS, add some styling. So I'm going to go to my style sheet here. So first thing that I want to do is, okay, so let me just what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just basically give I'm just going to give the article editor pane some styling. All right. So actually, let me start with the main. I want to style the main a little bit. Okay. So main, and I could use the ID, but since I have only one main element, I can use the name main, or let me use the ID if that's what most people prefer. Container. I'm just going to give it a width of 100%, and I'm going to give it a height of, let's say, auto for now. Okay, and as you may have seen from all my previous videos, whenever I start styling my HTML elements, I always initially give it a temporary border so that I can see where those HTML elements are, what are the dimensions of those HTML elements. So let me just give it a temporary border, which we can remove later. 1px solid black. Okay, so this is my styling for the main container, right? The main element which has an ID of container. Let me style the, so if you can see whether it is showing up, right? You can see it's showing up here. If you go back here, if you scroll, if you refresh it, excuse me, not scroll, you see this black box that appeared, right? Everything is inside this black rectangular box. Well, that black rectangular box is our main with ID container. Now let's keep styling the other stuff. Okay. Keep styling the other stuff here. Okay. Right. The other stuff here would be, I'm going to go for the editor pane. All right. So let me say #editor-pane. Okay, what I want to do here is, first off, I want to let me give it a border first. Okay, 1px solid, let's call it red. Okay, I want to now give the editor pane a width of, let's say I give it a width of 70%. Remember, our editor pane does not occupy the full width of the browser. It occupies only a part, a fraction. So I'm going to give it a width of 70%. Okay, and before I do that, actually, one thing I have to share with you is one thing that I missed adding here for the text area element is another attribute called rows. So a text area element, in order to give it some height, you do that using the rows attribute. Okay, and you can read up on it if you're not familiar with it. If you do not use the rows attribute, your text area element will show up as just a line. It will have no height. So I forgot to add that, so I'm going to add it now, right? I mean, it'll show up with some height, not no height, but we want it to have a better height, right? So right now our text area element does have some default height, right? But we want it to give it a bigger height, a taller height. The way to do that is using the rows attribute. I'm just going to give it a height of 14. So basically the rows attribute expects a positive integer, and so I've given it a 14 number. So let's see what it comes. Obviously we can change it later. Okay, now if I do that and if I refresh it, and look, it is much taller, right? Okay, so what I'm doing here is, now I want to give the editor pane a width of 70%. I also want to give the editor pane, let's see, I also want to give the editor pane some height. Height, I'm going to give it auto, because the height of the text area will drive the height of the whole editor pane. Remember, editor pane is our article, right, which contains all these elements. So I don't have to give the article a specific height. The height of elements inside the article will give the article whatever height it ends up with. So I'm just going to give it a height of auto. Okay, and I'm going to give it a margin, because remember, right now, if you look, our whole editor pane is sort of flush with the left hand side of the browser. We want this whole thing to be somewhere in the middle. So a good way to do that is give it some margin. Especially you want to give it a left and right margin of auto. I'm going to give the margin to all four sides using the for value syntax. So I'm going to say top margin of, let's say, I don't know, 50 pixel. Okay. Left and right margin of auto. Bottom margin of, let's say, 30 pixel, or yeah, that's 30 pixel, and right margin of auto. Okay. And what else? And what else? What else do I want to style? Okay. Well, actually, I'm getting a weird error here. I don't know why that is. Let's see here. Okay. I'm going again getting a weird error here. Let's see how that why that is. All right. Actually, it's gone, so it should be fine. So let's check how our page is shaping up. All right, not bad. So this is the styling we added, and look, our styling is taking shape. Our editor pane has moved to the center. Okay, it is equally spaced from the left and the right border of the browser. There is a margin on top and there's a margin below. Okay, so we are making progress. Now we obviously have a ways to go. So one of the things we need to fix is all these elements should not be squished up to the left. They need to be spread across all the way through. And similarly, the text area element should not be occupying the left-hand side of the editor pane. It should be spread out all across. So let's fix that for now, okay? So the way we do that is we want to give the text area element, right? We want to give that, first of all, we want to give the header. This header, which has the ID of editor-header, which contains all of this stuff, right? We want to give it a width. We want it to span the entire width of the editor pane. So let's do that. So I'm just going to select it using the ID header dash, I'm sorry, it is editor dash header. Okay, and we'll give it a width of 100%. Okay, and I'm going to give it a width of 100%. I'm also going to give it a background color of, let's say, I don't know, white smoke, some color that I've chosen. All right, and I'm also going to give it a let's see, editor-header. I also want to give it some sort of a let's see, give it a border for now, temporary border. Okay, 1px solid. Let's say blue. Okay, to actually see the dimensions. Okay, and we move this here so that it doesn't keep coming up here. Okay, all right, so this is the I've given some dimensions. Okay, let me do the same to the text area, right? So text area, I'm going to select it using its ID, which is editor. I want to make it span across the entire width of the editor dash pane, so I'm going to give it a width of 100%. Okay, and that should take care of what I need it to be. And let me give it a background color of white. Okay, and to make this make the editor visible, I need to change the background of the overall container, right? So I'm going to give it a background color. So what I'm trying to say is this: if I don't give this color, let me show you what I'm. If I don't give this color, if I gave the background to the editor a white. Right now, as you see, our background of the entire page is also white. So white on white will not show. So I have to change the background of the container, right, the main element, to something else, so that if anything else inside it, any other element inside it has a white background color, it shows up. So I'm going to give it a background of, let's see, I don't know, well, let me just choose Alice blue. I don't know what it is, but that's what I'll choose. All right, so now I've made some changes. Let's see how it looks. All right, let's see if the changes are taking effect. All right, changes are taking effect, right? Look, now our header spans the entire length, entire width of the editor pane. Look here, the blue box. Our text area, which was squished to the left, also now spans the entire width of the editor pane. Nice, that's what we want. Okay, now I want to change this background color a little bit because it's this color and this color are not contrasting a lot, and similarly this and this are not contrasting too much. I'm going to change that. But other major thing that we have to work with is, first of all, I want to, before I move any further and I style any of these elements, I want to show something, right? If you notice here, right, we see a weird space when I just scroll a little bit top or to the left and right, we see a weird space, right? That is because, and also we see this weird space below, right? We're seeing a space below the text area and the red box. Remember, the red box is our article element, right? Which contains all the elements in the editor pane. Contains the header and it contains the text area. But look, there is this margin, there is this gap, right? We didn't style the article with any margin or the text area with any margin. So why is there a gap between the text area and the parent article? Well, that's because that has to do with some default margins and paddings that every HTML element comes with, right? I don't know the exact number, but every HTML element, when you write it, it has a default margin and padding. We need to get rid of that, right? So the way we can do that is we write this few lines of CSS, right? So we'll have to say star, comma, colon, colon, after, comma, colon, colon, before, okay? And we will say padding equals 0, margin equals 0, and box sizing equals border box, okay? Now margin and padding equals 0 are self-explanatory. What we're saying with this lines of CSS code is that, hey, every element that I write in the HTML document, remove any padding and margin before, after, and around the element. That's what this whole code is saying. And box sizing basically means that for any nested element, if I give any margin or padding, keep the parent element size unchanged. Okay, and again, if you don't understand that well enough, it's okay. Just find some time to read up on this. Okay, so now that I have made this change, let's see, and let me change the background as well of the container to something darker. Let me say, let's see what's darker. How about beige? Let's go with beige, right? Let's see what beige comes, right? Now let's see what happens. Okay, so this is a better background, and look, now the margins are gone. Actually, this margin still exists, and I'll work on that a little bit later, but you've seen it's tighter. It's much tighter now than it was before. So as a matter of practice, always try to use this in order to get rid of the default margin and padding. Okay, now let's keep going with our code. So the next thing that I want to change is that affects the overall HTML is I prefer to give dimensions in REM units, which is relative EM units, right? And you probably know what it is. This is a type of unit that has come from the world of typography, right? Typography is a whole different sort of domain, so I'm not going to talk anything more about it because I don't know much about that domain. But there are many ways you can give dimensions to HTML element, right? You can do pixels, you can do REMs, you can do EMs, right? And you can also do in terms of the viewport height, VH and VW. Now I prefer most of the time to use REM and VH and VW. So in order to do REM units, in order to give dimensions in REM units, you have to basically, what you have to do is you have to define a default font size for the entire HTML document, right? If you don't do that, you cannot use REM unit. So that's why, and I have explained that in my previous video as well. So I'm going to basically define a default font size for my entire HTML document. The way I do that is I select the entire HTML document and I give it a font size of 16 pixel, which is more or less standard. Okay, and what I'll also do is I will choose a font family for my entire HTML document. I'll choose, let me just choose the first one, Courier. Okay, this is just a personal preference. You can choose different fonts for different elements here. I just like to keep it slightly simpler and choose one font family that will apply to the entire HTML document. So wherever I have text, it will use Courier New. That's what I'm saying here. And again, I have defined a default font size for the entire HTML because that will allow me to use REM units wherever I want. So the reason I changed, and the first place that I want to use REM units is here. The margin here I want to give 2 REM and I want to give 1 REM. Okay, and when I go in here, you will see that the margins adjust. Okay, good. All right, so now let's start working on these on this. So first off, these 4 elements should not be squished together all to the left of the header. They should be spread across. These 2 elements should be on the left and the 2 buttons should be on the right. So the way I want to accomplish that is I want to put these 2 elements, the logo and the editor text, inside a div, and I want to put the 2 buttons inside another div. And then I will use the flex property to basically, put them on each side of the header. All right. If that's something you didn't follow, let me basically do it. Right. So what I want to do is I want to put the I tag and the text inside its own div, inside its own container. So let me do that. I'm just going to use a div container here. I'm going to give it an ID of header-div1. Okay, and I'm going to move the ending of this div from here to after the here. Okay, and I'll just tab it so that we know which elements are contained within which elements. So that's my first div. The second thing I want to do is I want to put these two buttons also inside its own div. And you will see in a minute why I'm doing that. I'm going to open a div. I'm going to give it ID of, let's say, button-div1. Okay, and I'm going to move the closing div tag from here to after the buttons. Okay, I'm going to give the appropriate tabs to allow for the appropriate nesting. Okay, so what have I done here? All I've done here is I've taken these two elements and put it in its own div tag. It has an ID of header-div1, and I've taken the two buttons and I've placed it inside its own div tag with an ID of button-div1. Now these two IDs can be anything else. The requirements do not expect any specific ID, so feel free to change the ID if you like. I'm just going with what comes, what basically I could think of. Now, why did I put these two elements in its own div and these two buttons in its own div? Well, I did that so that I can make the header a display flex, and then I can easily space out the logo and the text and the buttons. So let's do that. So I'm going to put header whose ID is editor-header. There it is. I'm going to make it a flex. So I'm going to say display equals flex. Okay, and I'm going to use justify content as space between. Okay, and I'm going to do align items as center. All right, so now let's see what these 3 lines of code do to our header. Right, I'm going to go in here. What you should expect when I refresh the page is that the logo and this text editor should be on the left, and these two buttons should have moved all the way to the right. All right. In fact, before I do that, let me give it a temporary border here. You know what? Let me do that. I have added 2 divs. One has a header div-div1 ID, and the other has button-div ID of button-div1. Let me give it some border so you basically know what I am talking about here. Okay. So I'm just going to give it a temporary border here. So header div1, border is 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to give it green. Okay, and I'm going to give the other div, which is button-div1, also a border of 1 pixel solid green. Okay, now why am I giving this border? I just want you to see how those divs that I added are actually containing the elements around which the divs have been added. That's the only reason, right? The requirements do not expect us to put this border, and later we're going to remove all these temporary borders. So now when I refresh the page, you should see 2 green boxes, one here containing the logo and the editor, and 1 green box here containing the 2 buttons. Let's see what happens. And there you go, right? Now for some reason the borders are not, that's because I have not used the appropriate syntax here. I need to have a hash sign here. The green borders are not visible, as you can see, because I didn't use the hash sign. In order to select an element with its ID, you have to use the hash sign. So now when I refresh the page, you should see 2 green boxes, one here, one here. Let's do that. And there you go. This green box is visible. This green box is flush with the 2 buttons, so you cannot see it. All right, but our goal is achieved. We have these 2 elements to the left and these 2 buttons to the right. Right, now let's do some more polishing type styling. What I want to do is, first I want to give the article pane a rounded border, right? And I want to also make sure that the header and the text area also have a rounded border. So let me first, before I do that, let's adjust this, right? Let's first finish styling this. So I want the logo and the editor to have more space between them. And similarly, I also want the 2 buttons to have more space between them, right? So how can I do that? I can turn the green box into another display flex. I can turn each of the green box into a display flex and use the justify content and the align items properties to give it the appropriate amount of spacing. So let me do that. So header dash div1, I want to make it display equal display flex. Justify content is space between, and align items is, and align items I'm going to give it center, so it's horizontal, is vertically centered as well. And I'm going to increase the width of the green box so that it has more space. I'm going to make it I don't know, let's see, 7 rem. Let's see how it looks. Okay. Similarly, I also want to style the other one, the button dash div1, right? I want to style that because that is something that I also need to give it some space, right? So let me style button dash div1. I want to give it some width of, I want to give it a width of I don't know, let's say, let's say 4 rem, or let's say 5 rem. Okay. And what else? I want to make it display flex. Okay, justify content center, and align items center. Okay, now what we should see is that we should see when we refresh the page, I should see there should be more space between the logo and the text editor, and there should be more space between the buttons. So let me do that, and there you go. We have more space between the logo and this word editor, and we also have more space. Well, this is kind of weird, so I think we made a mistake here. Oh, justify content cannot be centered. Justify content has to be, that's the mistake we made. So the reason these two buttons are appearing all squished up is because we gave the value of center to justify content. I want to give you a value of space around, let's say. Okay, let's see what we get. All right, and nice and good. Now our two buttons also are basically have a nice space, around each other and between each other. All right, so things are shaping up well. Another thing that I want to keep changing as a polishing style is I want to give some padding to the logo. Right, I want the logo to basically have some padding from the left margin of the box. Right, so how can I do that? Well, one way I can do that is I can change the justify content for this div. I can do that like so. The div that houses the logo and the text is the div whose ID is header dash div1. I can make this from space between to space around, right? If I do that, I should get some spacing between the logo and the left border. And nice and good, I got it. That's exactly what I wanted. Okay, now what I would like to do is I want to increase the size of this logo, make it slightly bigger. And also I want to make this editor slightly bigger, right? So make the font slightly bigger. So how do I do that? I can basically give it a font size, right? So I'm going to select the font. I'm going to select the logo by its class. So the class of the logo is this. The way you style an icon is you select that name as a class name, right? Put the dot, put the name of the class, and come here and give it a font size of, and here we can choose any units, we can choose pixels, but since I'm using REMs, I'm going to give it a REM of 1. Let's say 2 REM. Okay, and let's see how it looks. Okay, it's slightly bigger and a little more prominent. I like that. Let me make it actually 1.3 REM. Okay, and I also want to give the font of I want to increase the font size of the editor, so I'm just going to go here. I'm going to add the font size CSS property. I'm going to make it 1 also 2 REM. Now and I'm going to add a font weight. I'm going to add a font weight just of, let's say, 700. Okay. Now again, these are personal preferences. Due to which I am doing this additional styling. These things will not help you pass it, but I care a lot about the look and feel. So that's why I do spend enough time, adequate time to basically spruce up the look of the page. All right, and look, we got it right. Our logo is bigger. Our editor is also now darker, and I want to give some letter spacing between the editor. So I'm going to say letter spacing of 1 pixel to our text. So if I do that, our editor, this editor should have the letters in the word editor should have some space amongst each other. And yep, you can see, right? And you know what? Looking at the text, I want to make one quick update. I want to let's see if I can change the font family, right? Let me see if I go with let's choose the next one, all right? Again, this is just a personal preference. I like to try out different fonts. Okay, that didn't change much, so let me try something else here. Font family of let's say, how about this, right? How about this? Let's see what it does here. All right, so for some reason it's not changing any of the fonts. I don't know why that is. Maybe because you may need to add the font directly to the element. So let's try to add the font family from here, and we remove it from here. Okay, let me try to remove it from here. Okay, and put it inside the editor pane. Right, let's see if our font family can be changed. If I do that, and yep, it does change. All right, our font family has now changed to something else. If I were to remove this, and if I would change this here, I just want to make sure that our font family. Okay, let's see if our font changes, and it does. Okay, and actually this is the font that I was aiming for, and I didn't see this font, and that's why I wanted to basically I was fiddling a little bit with the font family. For some reason, putting font family inside the HTML tag did not work. I have no idea why. It should work actually, to be honest with you. If you put the font family here, it should work. Let me try that again to see if we can do that. Let me take it out of here and put it here and save it here. It should still work. Okay, and it doesn't work for some reason. I have no idea why it's not working. So let me remove it from the HTML tag and put it inside the editor pane for the last time. But we have found a bug. If you have time, we'll try to fix it. Ideally, when you specify a font family or any CSS sort of property in the HTML tag, it should apply to everywhere that's relevant within the document. But clearly it's not happening, and we'll get to that if you have time. Right? Now this is what I was aiming for, but when I choose this, the space between the logo and the editor becomes smaller. So all I have to do is increase the size of the green box. So let me do that. Let me increase the size of the green box to, the green box has ID of editor-header. No, it has ID of header-div1. Let me make it 9 rem and see what happens, because I'd like to have some space between them. And yeah, that's what I wanted. I want some space between the logo and the text editor. All right, so that's some of the changes, some of the polishing type changes. That's why I added some additional CSS. Hopefully that allows you to learn more about how to make these types of styling changes. Now, let me try to polish this up a little bit in terms of adding some rounded corners, right? Rounded corners always look better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a rounded corner to the overall container, the red box, which, as you know, is the article element with the ID of editor-pane. So I'm going to find that editor-pane element that we've already styled. I'm going to give it a border radius of 4 pixels all around. Let's see what happens. Do we get it? Okay, so we give it a border radius. We only saw the border radius at the bottom. Okay, we didn't see any border radius and in the top. Well, why is that? That's because the element that is right inside the article, right inside the red box, that still has sharp corners. So that is why, even though we applied a border radius to the entire box, entire red box, which is our entire article, we are only seeing the curved corners, rounded corners at the bottom, because there is no element inside the article that is flush with the bottom. So the bottom is free to go round as per the CSS styling we just applied. But the top of the article, the top of the red box has this header, this gray box, right? And that still has sharp corners. So that is why this is still showing sharp corners. So let's give the header some sharp corners only for the top left and the top right, because that's all we need. So that box is called header-div1. So let's find it. header dash div1 is right here, and we'll give it a border radius of top left 4px, top right 4px, and the rest can be 0 and 0. Okay, so that's fine. We also need to give the text area element a rounded corner for the bottom left and for the bottom right, right? So let's do that. Remember, we don't need to give any rounded edges for the top left and the top right of the text area element, right? Because that needs to be, that is feeding into, that is getting joined into the base or the bottom of the header element. So we don't need to give rounded corners to all 4 corners of the header or the text area. That's the point I'm trying to make, right? For the header, I just gave the rounded corners to the top left and the top right corner, and now when I refresh, you will see, look, it's much more rounded. Okay, you can see that. And I will now give the rounded corners to the bottom left and the bottom right of the text area. So let me find the text area. Did we, and this right here. And yeah, let me just give it here. So I'll just say border radius of top right 0, top left 0, top right 0, bottom right 4px, and bottom left 4px. This should, now what you should see is that these 2 corners, this guy and this guy, should turn rounded a little bit. And they do. Okay, we are in good shape. Okay, so let's keep going here. All right, now what I want to do now is I want to style the buttons, right? These buttons look a little bit weird. They look like, you know, sort of elongated, you know, vertical rectangles. I want them to be nice and square, so let me style the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to access the button using the button name, okay? Because the styling I will apply to the buttons will apply to all buttons. We have a total of 4 buttons on this page, so let me do that. So first I'm going to give it a width of 1.5 rem, and we can use rem units. Height of 1.5 rem. Okay, I'm also going to give it a background color of light gray. Okay, and I'm going to also remove the border. Okay, I don't need the border. I'm gonna give it a border none. So I give the buttons a bunch of styling. Let's see how they look. I'm going to come here. Let me refresh the page. All right, look, you can see the styling has taken effect. The buttons look a little more symmetrical. They all have a gray background. There is no border around the buttons, right? Don't get confused with the green box. The green box is a div, right? That border we'll remove later. But the button itself has no borders. It has a it has a gray background, and it has the icons placed middle in the center. Now, if you want to give the icons some color, right, you can just say, you can use the I tag just to access the I elements, and you can give it a color of, let's see, what color do you want to give? Let's see, let's say we want to give this icon a color of, let's say, light, I don't know, light coral or light blue. All right, and I want to give the rest of the icons, right, the rest of the icons, which we can access using either the icon IDs, or we can simply use the name of the element, right? All icons are within or need the I tag. So in order to give some styling to all the I tags, you know, you don't have to write down the ID of all the I tag. That's very wordy. All you do is take the I tag and give it a color of, I don't know, let's see, what color can I give it? Maybe I can give it, how about, I don't know, how about, let's try antique white, right? I like to experiment with the look and feel, just a personal thing. Okay, so this is kind of too light. I don't know if it's going to be easily visible, right? So let's choose a different color, maybe a dark maybe, I don't know, dark, how about a dark khaki, right? Let's see how that looks. All right, not bad, not bad. You know, in fact, if you want something different, more pronounced, let's choose a dark, how about a dark or olive green, right? Let's choose that. That should stand out more against the background. All right, this almost looks like, you know, black, but that's fine. Let's stick with that, right? Don't need to spend more time trying to polish these things. You can, the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, if look and feel is important to you, feel free to experiment with the font size, with the colors, with the background colors, right? And get your right look and feel. All right, so now our editor pane is more or less ready. Let's remove all the temporary borders. Okay, one thing I want to do is I want to give some more spacing here to this green box. So let me do that. Let me go to that that div. That div is header-div1, right? Let me increase the width to 10 rem. Okay, and now let's get rid of all the borders here that I don't need. So I don't need the border for the main actually, let me keep that for now, because I'll show you how when we add the previewer box, or the previewer pane, how the height of the main container adjusts. So let me leave that border for now, but I think we can get rid of the other border. So let me get rid of the editor pane border here. Okay, let me get rid of the editor header border here. We need it. Let's see how it looks. Now we may add some border later based on the aesthetics, but let's do that when we come to it, right? Let me remove, where else do we have border? We have a border here. Obviously this definitely has to go because this was temporary. This green border has to go. It's temporary. Remove that here. Do we have border anywhere else? No, we don't. So now let's see how it looks. Okay, we come here, you should see all the borders disappear. And they have. Okay, the only border we have is of the text box. And you know what? I don't like it. I want to get rid of this border as well. Again, you can leave it. It's not going to affect the functionality, but I prefer to get rid of this border because it looks kind of... So this is called the focus border. So remember, when I click outside the text area, there's only a light black border. But when I click inside the text area, I see a dark blue border. So I want to do two things. I want to change this border to a, something else, and I want to remove the focus border, right? So the way I can do that is in the text area. First off, I can go to the text area element, which is this editor. I'll say outline equals none. Okay, this should get rid of this focus border. So let me refresh it. And look, when I click inside, there is nothing. There is no, the focus border doesn't come. The focus border, remember previously, there was a dark blue thing that showed up whenever you would click inside the text area, right? And it would disappear when we would click outside. Now, whether we click outside the text area element or inside the text area element, you only see this thin, darkish border. Well, I want to change that as well. I want to give it a border of, let's say, a different border, more aesthetically pleasing to me. Should be sky blue. All right, let's see how this looks. All right, to me it looks slightly better, so I'm going to go with this. Right, so we have our text area element more or less completed. Right, now when you type, look, the text area element, as you know, is an element that is used to take user input. When I type here, look, the user input is there, right? But let's see, but wait a minute, this user input, as you can see, is getting flushed with the left edge and the top edge, right? How about we give some spacing so that when we type, when the user types in here, the letter doesn't start on the left edge or the top. It starts a little bit, you know, with some gap between the left border of the text area element and the top border of the text area element. It's very easy to do that. All you got to do is give it some padding. So I'm going to go to into the editor element, the text area element, which you remember has an ID of a hash editor. I'll just give it a padding, overall padding of I don't know, 1 rem. Right, let's see how it looks. And now when I come here, refresh the page, and if I type, you should be able to see the look. The typing shows up with a little bit of gap between the left edge of the text area element and the top edge of the text area element. In fact, if you were to type and fill up the whole space, okay, you will see a gap from the right border as well. Look, there's a nice gap from the right border as well because we gave it an overall padding of 1 rem. Right? We are making good progress. So our text area element is almost ready. Okay, now let's change our focus to our preview element. So we have built the text area editor. The only thing that I want to change here is that this height is much smaller. So let me change that. Our text area element is very wide. Let me change the height to of the text area element to something, I don't know, 10. Let's see if that makes sense. Go back here. And all right, this is much better. I kind of like it. And let me also reduce the width of it to something else, just to match our mockup. So our entire editor pane width, I gave it as 70%. Let me make it 60%. Okay, and let's see how it looks. Right, looks better, closer to what I need. Again, if you could have left it at what we had, it would make a difference. But I'm big on sort of aesthetically pleasing stuff, so this looks slightly better to me, and it's closer to the mockup that we are trying to imitate here. Okay, very good. Now let's turn our attention and create the previewer box. Now, as you may have already noticed by now, the previewer box is very similar to the editor box, right? Look, it has this header right here, which has a logo, which has a text previewer, right? Instead of editor up top, it has the word previewer here. And on the right, you have the same 2 buttons with the same 2 icons, right? And below here, this element in the light gray, whatever this color is, this is not a text area. This can be any other HTML element. It could be an article, it could be a section, it could be a div, a P element, whatever you like. But this is not a text area element because you are, as a user, not expected to be able to type here. You can only type here, okay? But you are not expected to type here. So this element below cannot be a text area. It has to be something else, right? So that is the only difference, right? Otherwise, basically, the previewer whole box, the whole previewer box and the editor box are very alike. The only differences are, number 1, this word here says previewer instead of editor. Number 2, this is wider than the editor. Number 3, it's a bit longer than the editor. And number 4, this element in the light gray background cannot be a text area. It has to be anything else. Those are the only 4 differences. But otherwise, we can basically reuse a lot of the HTML that we wrote here. So let's do that and save ourselves a bunch of time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically copy this entire section here, because this is our entire, this lines of HTML code basically creates the entire editor box, right? And we want to create the previewer box now. And we just saw that the previewer box and the editor box are very much alike, except for those 4 things, which we can make adjustments via CSS. So that's why I'm justified to copy this and to reuse this. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to paste it below. Now, obviously, we have to carefully change all the IDs because, as you know very well, HTML, you cannot have 2 elements with the same ID. So let's first change the IDs. So I'm going to make this previewer pane. Okay, I'm going to change this ID to preview header. Okay, I'm going to change this ID to header.div2. Right, I'm going to change the letter here, the word here, to previewer. I'm going to change this ID to button-div2. Right, again, no 2 elements in HTML can have the same ID, so that is why I'm changing the IDs. It should be self-evident. I also need to change the ID of the buttons. Remember, the buttons up top were part of the editor, so I gave it ID of E-expand and E-compress. I'm going to change this by simply changing 1 letter. I'm going to make it P-exp and P-com. P-exp is the button for expansion, and P-com is the button for compression. All right? What else do we need to change? Well, another thing we need to change is we cannot have the text area element. Remember, as I explained, you know, the previewer cannot have a text area element. So I'm going to delete this. Okay, I'm going to put something else. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this. I don't know why this happened here. I'm going to put anything else. I'm going to just put another, I don't know, I'm just going to put another div, right? But I do have to use a specific ID. Requirements expect that the previewer has an element whose ID is preview. So there is no wiggle room there. I can not choose any ID. I have to choose an ID of preview. Again, that is specified in the requirements. But all this other stuff, we can use any ID you like, right? You can choose the ones I have, or you can choose something else, right? Now let us see how our thing is shaping up. What do we see? We should see some weird stuff, but let's see what it is. All right, look, our previewer is squished up all the way to the left. So whatever we added by copying and pasting the code is showing up. That's the good news. But the bad news is, all right, actually it's not a bad news, but we just have to make some styling adjustments so that this previewer box shows up right in the center, right, and occupies the vertical space just like here, right? So let's make those adjustments. And we know why our previewer, the elements we just added right now, are showing up all the way to the left, because we have not styled it. So let's style it, okay? So I'm going to go into my HTML. I'm going to, first of all, preview pane. I'm just going to call it actually preview pane, not preview pane, not previewer pane, right? That's better. So let me first go in here, and I want the preview pane to also have, I want the preview pane. So we can use a lot of the properties of the editor pane. So I can just add here. Remember, we can reuse many of the properties of the, so we don't have to rewrite a lot of the CSS properties, right? Remember, editor pane and preview pane are very much alike. So let's try to reuse that. So I'm just going to add preview-pane. Okay, and let's see what happens here. By adding just this one line of code, by adding the ID of the preview pane, preview-pane, right, the article we just added, let's see what changes we get. And boom, everything moved to the center, right? Let me add a border here temporarily, right, just to see how the preview pane is showing up. 1 pixel solid, let's call it red. Okay, so now our previewer box is showing in the bottom, but clearly it needs more work. So let's do that work, right? So first off, we need to do is we need to make these elements just like here, right? The logo and the text should be on the left with adequate spacing amongst each other and around each other, and the two buttons need to be on the right with adequate spacing amongst each other and around each other. So let's do that. We can do that by simply adding the elements to the code we have, styling code we have already written. So let's first go after the header. So header, preview header, we will basically add it to the same section as the editor header, right? So we can reuse a lot of the code. So editor header, I'm just going to go here. I'm going to add hashtag preview header, and let's see what changes that brings to our, and voila, look, immediately our logo and the word previewer move to are in the left, and the buttons move to the right. Obviously we have to do more styling, so let's do that. Another one thing I want to do is our previewer is wider than the editor, right? So let's do that. Let's add a little more width to the previewer box. We can do that by just selecting the preview pane ID here and giving it a wider width of 80%, and let's see if it takes shape. And yep, it does. Look, our previewer box, whatever box we can see for the previewer element, becomes wider. Isn't that nice? Because that's what exactly we expected, right? So let's keep going. So now let's basically give some spacing, some bigger spacing between the logo and this text previewer, you know, amongst each other and around each other, and also adjust the spacing here. We can do that by simply adding the appropriate IDs to the existing CSS code. So we have two new IDs, header-div2 and button-div2. Let's add that to the appropriate CSS code. So we had header-div1, right? So let me add here header-div2, okay? And here let me add hash btn-div2. By doing this, we are reusing. Hopefully you're seeing what I'm doing here. It in a common sense requires us, coding practice requires us to not repeat the same code. So we can definitely reuse a lot of the existing code because styling is very similar. So that is why I'm simply adding the new IDs that we created to the existing CSS code so as to reuse the existing CSS code. So now let's see what happens. Look what happened. Look, we got some nice spacing between the logo and the word previewer, and we got some nice spacing between the two buttons and on the side of the two buttons. Now one thing, since the previewer word contains more letters than editor, it needs more space. So let me increase the space for the div that contains this logo and previewer, right? Let me do that. How do I do that? I can simply create another. I can select that particular element, which is header-div2, right? And I'm going to give it a width of, let's say, 11 rem, right? By doing so, when I refresh this page here, I should see more spacing between the logo and the word previewer. Let's see if it happens. Wow, it does. There is definitely more space. Let me give it some more space here. Let me make it 13 rem and see if it leads to more space, and it should. And it does. This is something that I prefer better, right? All right. We don't need to adjust the space of the button. The buttons have good space amongst each other and to the right, so we leave it as such, right? Now, what we need to do is we need to basically, if you notice, our div that we added here, right? Look, we added a div here, right? The div is completely invisible, right? Well, it's visible, but we just haven't given it a height. So let's give it some height here, okay? We can basically select the the preview, and we can basically give it some height. We can, in other words, we can select it using its ID, right? Preview, and we can give it a nice height, right? So I'm going to give it a height of, let's see here, I'm going to select it, okay? So I'm going to create this, I'm going to create this right below this because it's, they're similar in some ways. So I'm going to select that element with its ID preview, and I'm going to first give it a border of 1 pixel solid sky blue, okay? I'm going to give it a height of 100 VH, okay? Give it a height 100 VH. I'm 100 VH. What else do I need to do, right? I also need to, let's see how it looks, right? Let's see how it looks. And there you go. Look, now our previewer element is much bigger, but actually there is a slight issue. If you notice here, our sky blue element is actually being overlapped by the red box, right? So in other words, if I remove the border that I gave it to this whole preview pane box, we should see the sky blue element. Let me do that. Let me go back to our editor and remove the border. Well, not the editor. I want to remove the border from here, the pane. Right? I gave it another temporary border to see how it's shaping out. Let me remove the red border here, and now we should be able to see. You should be able to see what I mean. Now look, right? Look, now we can see our previewer element in its full glory, pretty much, right? We have the header with the logo and the word previewer. We have the two buttons on the right, right? And they all have nice, healthy spacing amongst each other and around each other. And look, the sky blue sort of outline, right? This outline, or this not outline, excuse me, the border, the sky blue border we have styled the preview element, right? We have used this preview element, right? This div with ID preview. That is what we have given it a sky blue border, right? Look here, border sky blue, and that is visible here, right? In fact, if you want to make the border more visible, let's give it a 2 pixel. All right, so it becomes a little more visible. All right, now it's more visible. So now things are looking really good. Now I want to give the previewer also a white background so it stands out from the background of the container. So I'll just go here and I'm going to give it a background color of white. Okay, and look, we have our previewer element, visible exactly as we need it. Actually, we just need to do a couple of more things. We need to give the rounded corners to the previewer, entire previewer container, right? Which is this, everything that contains the previewer elements. Just like we did rounded corners to this whole element, we need to do the same here. So first we'll give the entire previewer pane rounded corners of 4px, and then we'll adjust the rounded corners for the header, this gray header, the top left and the top right, and we'll adjust the rounded corners for the bottom left and bottom right of the element whose ID is preview. So let's do all that here. And again, you should follow this easily because we did that for the editor pane. So first I'm going to do is I'm going to go to preview, and I'm going to give it a, well, not preview, I'm going to give it a preview pane. And actually it should have the border radius already, so this is good. I'm just going to give it the editor header, or this editor header. Yeah, this is what I need to give a border radius of 4 pixel top right, 4 pixel top left, 0, 0. All right, and I need to give the preview, the div with ID's preview, a border radius of bottom right 4px and bottom left 4px. So bottom, so top right is 0, top left is 0, top right is 0, bottom right is 4px, bottom left is 4px. Okay, all right. And you know what? I like the thin border, so I'm going to make it back to 1px, the sky blue borders. Again, this is just a personal preference, doesn't affect the functionality. But now you will notice, right? Look, our borders are nice and rounded, right? We have nice rounded borders up top. You should be able to see that. In fact, let me do this. Let me give it a different background. Change the background of the container so everything becomes more visible. How about I change it to a dark I don't know, dark slate gray. How does that look? A lot of the UI styling has to do with trial and error, so don't be afraid of doing that. All right, not bad, right? This makes it more pronounced, right? Okay, let's stick with this. Now you can see the rounded corners much better. Look, our editor has 4 rounded corners, right? And our previewer also has 4 rounded corners, exactly as we did it, exactly as we wanted it, right? So let's leave this as is. All right, so guys, for the most part, our UI element is complete. We have successfully created the HTML and the CSS to make our UI element look like what we originally planned, which is the editor box with a whole bunch of these elements and the previewer box with a whole bunch of these elements. Okay, now we may need to come back when we start coding. We will need to come back and maybe adjust some CSS, right? But for the most part, the UI has most of its visible, obvious UI elements. They are ready. We have successfully created vast majority of the UI elements. All right, so next we're going to move and start to code the app using JavaScript and mostly jQuery. All right, so we're ready to code the logic of this app using, as I have mentioned, JavaScript and jQuery. But before I do that, I want to address one more thing. So I have been saying repeatedly through the video that at any one point in time, only one of these 2 buttons are visible, right? In fact, when you load the page, you should only see the expand button. You should not see you should see only the expand button, right? Which is this button, this square, the button with the square icon. You should not see the other button, right? We have seen that repeatedly, right? So for example, if you go back to this, right, you only see one button. And when you click on this, right, the whole thing expands, and then the expand button disappears, and in its place you see the compress button, right? So I want to build that or code that functionality in here. Right now we see both buttons, and that is clearly not the way it is supposed to be. So let's address that, right? So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is the logic that I'm going to use is basically I'm going to create a CSS class, right? And in that class, I'm going to give a property use the property display and give it a value of none. And then I'm going to assign that class to the button that I don't want to be visible on page load, right? That's the logic that I'm going to use. So let me first go here to CSS, to my CSS file. Right down here, I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it .hide class. I'm going to give it a display of none. Okay, give it the property, give the property display and give it a value of none. And then I'm going to come here, and the button that I want to be hidden or to be invisible on page load, I will simply assign that class to that button, right? So when the page loads, the compress button is supposed to be hidden, right? Because when the page loads, you see both the boxes, the previewer box and the editor box, and both can be expanded. So in other words, the compress button is hidden. So all I have to do is put a class here and assign it the class hide that we created in CSS. All right, and let me do the same for the compress button on the previewer pane. So I go here, I add the class hide to this button. All right, so here we go. Let's see if we get our intended effect. So I'm going to reset the page. When I refresh the page, excuse me, this button should disappear, right? And there you go, right? We have just one button, which is the expand button. Now clearly when you click the button, nothing happens, right? Nothing happens here because, well, we haven't added that functionality. All right, but we will obviously add that when we code the logic. One of the things we're going to code is the behavior of the button as to what happens when we click on it, right? But we have addressed, on page load, we will have just one button. All right, so now let us go to our script.js file. As you know, this is the file that I created before I started the video, just to sort of prepare. Now, I have not written any code. You do see a bunch of stuff here. This is not really any code. This is just a variable, right? All I've done so far in the JavaScript file is that I just created a variable and assigned it some text. That's it, right? Clearly, it should be obvious to you why I did that. If I were to type all this live on this video, it'll take up a huge amount of time, right? So I wanted to save that time. There is once again, there is not any sort of real coding that I've done here. All I've done here is I've declared a variable called input text or input txt, and I have given it this whole string, right? Now, why have I given it this string? Well, basically I gave it the string that I basically plucked or took from here, all right, from this page, from this version of the app that whoever coded, right? Now, why is this important? Well, because as you know from the requirements, right, requirements clearly states that when the Markdown previewer first loads, right? If you look at requirement number 5, it says clearly that when the Markdown previewer first loads, the default text in the hash editor field should contain valid Markdown that represents at least one of each of the following elements, and then it lists all the elements that it needs. So this requirement number 5 is basically saying that, hey, when you load the page, you cannot load a blank page. You gotta have some default text here, and that default text must be valid Markdown, and it also must contain some specific types of elements such as H1, such as H2, such as a link, inline code, etc., etc., right? So in this version, you already have that. So I'm basically reusing this, right? So all I did was basically pretty much copied this whole thing and I assigned it to this variable input txt, all right? Again, just to give you the background of where this variable is coming from, this is the variable that I have created to assign the default text, right? Now you may notice here that this default text has a lot of the Markdown. It has the single hash, it has the double hash, it has the triple hash, right? It has the backtick, right? It has stuff or text within 2 backticks. It also has 3 backticks and a lot of stuff within 3 backticks. These 3 backticks start here and they end somewhere here, right? So there is a lot of valid Markdown here in this variable. And once again, I assigned it. I created this variable so that I can show the default text on page load, right? So when I load the page, I should get like something like this. I should not have a blank editor box, right? So I will use the variable that I created, the variable input text, to basically display all the stuff here, and also to display it, also to parse it and display it here. So let's do that and see what we get. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to add my first line of code. So as I said, the first thing I want to do is I want to display this text in my editor box, right? So I'm going to grab the ID of the editor, which is $, excuse me. All right, so I'm going to, so I don't know why it's going outside. All right, and I'm going to grab the editor or the text area whose ID is editor. So I'm going to, as you know, as is common in jQuery, you grab an element using either the ID or the class or a variety of ways. I'm using one of the most easy ways of basically selecting an element using jQuery, which is using its ID, and then I'm going to basically use the val method on it. And into the val method, I'll pass an argument, which is our variable input txt. And let's see what it does. What I expect that it should do is that you should see this whole text in the editor box, right? So this should no longer be, when I refresh the page, this should no longer be empty. You should have, and there you go. Look what you got. You got all the stuff, the raw text here in this page. Okay. All right. So, all right. I am seeing one issue that I'm seeing is I'm seeing, if you notice here, 3 ones. This should not be 3 ones. It should be actually, you know what? Okay. What it should be here is a numbered list 1, 2, and 3. And the reason we're saying we are not seeing 1, 2, and 3 is because I have 1, 1, and 1. So let me change that here. And that should take care of things. That should make the ordered list numbers appropriate. And yep, 1, 2, and 3. That's what we needed. And if you so that's what we did here. All we did was we grabbed this editor, this text area with this ID editor, and we used the val method, and we passed to it the input text, the variable which contains this entire markdown text, and we have now on page load. So every time you page load now, you will see something here. Okay, now just to do a quick check, this is exactly what we have here. Okay, this is exactly what we have here. All right, now that's not enough, right? According to the requirements, you should not only have on page load some markdown text in the editor box, you should also have the corresponding HTML conversion. In other words, you should also have the corresponding parsed text or parsed content in the previewer box, right? That's also what is expected according to requirements. So if you just look here, requirement number 6 says, when my markdown previewer first loads, the default markdown in the editor field should be rendered as HTML in the hash preview element. Okay, should be rendered as HTML in the hash preview element. So what it means is that not only should you have some markdown text on page load in the editor box, and we have taken care of that, you should also have that parsed and rendered here in the previewer box. So let's do that. In order to do that, all we have to do is we have to basically basically the logic would be we just grab this whole text, right? We'll grab this text using the variable where this markdown text is stored. The variable is obviously input text. We will parse it and store the content of the parsed material into another variable, okay? And then we will display that variable's content in the preview box. As simple as that. So first, step number 1, we have to parse all of this and store the parsed content in a variable. So let me declare a variable. I'm going to declare a variable. I'm going to call it HTML. Okay. This is just a variable name, so don't get confused with something else. This is just a variable name. I'm going to call it HTML. And what I'm going to store in this variable called HTML, I'm going to store the parsed content of this raw markdown text. And how do I do that? I will call the marked parser like such. You call it with the syntax marked.parse, and you pass it the variable that contains the markdown text, which is the variable with name input text. Okay, now the variable that we just created called HTML contains the parsed version or the converted version or the interpreted version of this markdown text, which is stored in this variable input text. Okay, so that's what HTML contains. Now all we have to do is basically display the contents of HTML in the preview, in the box which has an ID of preview. That's what the requirements expect us to do, right? They want us to display the parsed content, the converted content, right here in this div. Well, what is the ID of the div? It's preview. So I'm going to grab the div with this ID like so. Okay, and I'm going to, here, since I know that the parsed content is basically HTML elements, so I'm going to use the HTML method of jQuery to and pass it the argument, which is our variable called HTML. All right, and that's how I expect, I know that I will be able to display the parsed content in the element whose ID is preview. Okay, let's see if it does it. I'm going to refresh the page. When I refresh the page, I should see a bunch of stuff here, which is the parse content. Let's see what happens. And there we go. Look, now we are seeing our parse content. Right? Now clearly there are some issues. There should not be a break in this box. There should be one continuous box, but we'll deal with that, right? But for the most part, look, we had the raw marked down content in the editor box, right? And look, what we have here is the parsed content, right? A single hash has converted the text that is preceded by a single hash is converted to an H1. The text that is preceded by a double hash is converted to an H2. The text that is preceded by a triple hash is converted to an H3. So we know that our marked parser that we are using is working correctly, number one, and our code is rendering it correctly as expected in the preview box. So we are moving in the right direction. Now clearly there's some issues with the here, like for example, all the text in the previewer box is basically, is basically flush or just sticking to the left border. We need to fix that, right? So let's fix that first. The way we can fix that first is basically give the previewer box a margin. Okay, we'll do that. The other thing that we're seeing is that, well, we're seeing that this thing is getting broken up into the content in the previewer box is spilling over, right? See, a lot of the content is inside the previewer box as expected, but a lot of the content is now spilling over into the regular outside the previewer box. Because remember, the previewer box, the previewer whole thing ends right here. Okay, so we do expect that the content should be enclosed within the previewer box. It should not spill over like this into the general container. So the way we'll also address that. So let's try addressing those things. All right. So first off, I'm going to go into my CSS. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply padding to my preview container, the container or the div where I'm supposed to display the parse content. That container has the ID of preview. I'm just going to give it a padding of, let's say, 1 rem, or yeah, I guess I could give it a padding. Maybe I can give it a different padding. Maybe I give it a padding of 1 rem top. You know what? Let me just go with 2.5 rem and see how it looks. Okay, let's see if it brings about the change we expect. I'm going to refresh the page. I expect some space between the left border of this box and the text. And there we go. Look, Now we have stuff which is looking nicely, which has a nice sort of a healthy space between the text and the left border, and the text in the top border, and the text in the right border. So this is good. In fact, what I'm going to do is, in fact, let me see if I can increase the space, make it a little bit more, just from an aesthetic point of view, make it 2.7. Let's see what it does. It should obviously increase the padding for the preview box, and it does. This looks better to me, so I'll go with this. All right, now the other thing that we have to fix, the big aspect we have to fix, is that the content, the rendered content, right, the parsed content must all fit within the element whose ID is preview, meaning it should all fit within this box with the white background. The reason it's not doing so is that we have given this box whose ID is preview a fixed height of 100 VH. That is the problem. So the content is much longer than 100 VH, and that is why the content is spilling over outside, from spilling over below the bottom of the white box whose ID is preview. Again, this, when I say this white box, I'm talking about the element whose ID is preview. All right, so again, so I'm going to fix that. Easy fix to that, I'll just give it a height of auto, and this should take care of the spilling, and it does. Look, no more spilling over. The entire content is now inside this white box, this whole white box. Okay, and again, the white box has an ID of preview as expected, right? But wouldn't it be nice to have a scroll bar here, so that we don't have to rely on just the scroll bar of the browser, right? It would be nice. I mean, it doesn't make, you can still get to see the entire content that is inside the white box whose ID is preview, but I'd like to give it a vertical scroll bar. The way you do that is you just go here and you say overflow y equals auto. What this does is that if the content is bigger than a certain amount, it automatically brings up or creates a scroll bar. So when I refresh the page, I should see a scroll bar. All right, I don't see a scroll bar at the moment because the height is accommodating the entire content. So if you want to see this scroll bar, I would have to make the height back to 100 VH. Let's see what happens if I do that. Okay, 100 VH, and now what I expect is the content will remain within the white box whose ID is preview. At the same time, you should see a scroll bar. Let's see, and there you go. You see, look here, we got a scroll bar. Okay, now the content is no longer spilling below the bottom of the white box. Why? Because now we have given it a scroll bar. Now, even though we changed the height of the preview element, of the element whose ID is preview, we changed his height back to 100 VH, right? But yet the content is staying within the white box. Why? Because we have given it a scroll bar. And since we have styled it with a scroll bar, the content no longer needs to spill over. It stays all within the white box. All right. Now, how about this image? This whole image, FREECODECAMP, right? This is an image basically. It's really huge. It's sort of sticking out like a sore thumb. It is not matching with the sort of the aspect ratio. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we can basically reduce its size? Yeah, let's do that. So as I said, that's basically an image, and the way you can reduce its size is simply select the image with its image with the image label, with just the image name, which is img. The reason I don't need an ID to select this image is because this is the only image on this page. So if I just select img, only that specific image will be selected, because again, there is no other image. So I can simply select the image and I can give it a width of 70%. All right, and let me see if I can give it also a margin of, let's say, 0.5 rem. All right, this margin will go all around the image. So let's see what happens now. When I refresh the page, I expect the image to be much smaller with a healthy gap all around it. Okay, let's see. And voila, look at this. Looks good, right? Now we have the FREECODECAMP image in a much more palatable in terms of viewing experience. And as you can notice, the horizontal scroll bar has also vanished because none of the content is going beyond the right border of this white box, this element whose ID is preview, right? So the horizontal scroll bar has disappeared because it's no longer needed. We still have the vertical scroll bar, and look, things are looking much better, right? All right, very good. Now, a couple of styling things we still have to do here, right? So one of the things that is not obvious when you review the document, when you review the marked documentation, it becomes obvious then. So when you come here and review the marked documentation, if you look at the specs and whatnot and options, it becomes clear that when you have text, when you have any code, like for example, anything that is between three backticks, right? Anything between three backticks, like it's here, is basically a code block. And the way the marked parser renders it is that it renders all the content between the backticks, right? So as you can see here, there is three backticks here and three backticks here, right? So according to the marked parser syntax, any content between three backticks becomes a code block, and it gets rendered as a pre-tag. All right, so what you have here, this whole section here, is a pre-tag. The reason you don't see it, you don't see any visible difference here, is because we haven't styled it, right? That is why, right, it appears basically as a, it appears as a block, but it is not pronounced. In order to make it appear, more pronounced, let's do some styling, right? So as I said, any content, whenever a marked parser encounters three backticks, it basically creates a pre-tag and puts all the stuff, all the content between the three backticks, it puts it inside the pre-tag. So let's style the pre-tag and make this whole section, a little more obvious. So I'm going to go to my CSS. I'm going to go here. I'm going to select the pre-tag by just using the tag name pre. And why? Because this is the only pre-tag in our previewer box. So I'm just going to select it. I'm going to give it a width of 70%. Okay, and I'm going to give it a background color. Let's say antique white. And I'm going to give it a padding of 0.5 rem. Just some padding, right? Just, you can change the numbers if you like. Now what I expect to see here, what you should expect to see here when I refresh the page is that this whole section should appear in a white background block, and we should make this whole section much more pronounced. And there you go. Look, this whole section is now inside a block. It looks like a block. It stands out, right? Right? We just basically applied some styling to make it stand out, right? But any content between three backticks is basically converted into a sort of a code block in HTML terms. All right. What else? The other thing that I also would like to turn your attention to is this block code, right? As you know, a block code is an HTML element that is used to display content that you're quoting from some other website. So let's say you're quoting some writer from his or her website, right? The appropriate way to do that would be to basically put that quote and make a reference to that site in one of the attributes within the block quote, right? So block quote again is an HTML tag. Please do read up on it if you're not familiar with it. But the reason block quote, so right now, the point you should know is that block quote is basically whenever you a marked parser encounters a single text, basically not a single text, excuse me, a single a greater than arrow, whatever text follows after that gets converted into a block quote HTML element. Okay, and that's what we have here. This is a block quote HTML element, right? Now I would like to make it a little more pronounced, right? So the way I do that is apply some styling. So I'm going to go back to my CSS. I'm going to just access the block quote or select the block quote by just using the name of the HTML element, which is block quote. Okay. And again, I can do that because there is only one block quote in our Markdown previewer. So by using the HTML name, I'm only going to select that specific element. And the only styling I'm going to give here is that I'm going to give it a left border left of, let's say, 2 pixels, and solid, and let's say olive. I'm just going to choose this color. I'm going to give it brown, let's say. How about this color? All right, and I'm going to give it a padding of I'm going to give it a padding of 1 rem. Okay. Yeah, you know, let me try to give the border without. Let me try to give the border without the padding, so you can see how it looks. So now when I refresh the page, you should see the block code right here with the left border. You see this? Now previously there was no left border. Now we have a left border. Now I want to give some space between the text block code and the actual border. So let me just do that by just giving it a padding. Okay, I'm going to say padding. I'm going to say padding left 1 rem. Now I should see space between this text block code and this brown line, or whatever color that is. And there you go. Look. So all I did was I applied some styling to make the block code stand out. So don't be confused. This line is as a result of styling. It is not the result of the HTML element. All right. Okay, very good. Now, what else should I want to take care of, right? The one other thing that is not quite standing out is the table. Look, this is basically a table. Okay, this whole thing is a table, right? If you look carefully, right, it has, you know, it has content, it has a header, and it has columns, but none of that is visible. Why none of that is visible? Because we have not delineated a table. When you see a table anywhere in your Word document or in a PowerPoint, you expect the table to have, you know, basically some border and some cells, right? This table, even though it is rendered as a table, and if you look in the HTML, you will see that the table element that has been created by the marked parser, right? So what I mean is, whenever a marked parser encounters this stuff, right, this kind of syntax, this pipe, whenever a marked parser encounters this kind of a syntax, the pipe and whatnot, right, it converts it to a table. Okay, but the reason it's not standing out is that we don't have the border of a table, we don't have the borders of each of the cells of the table. So let's try to do some styling to make the table stand out. Okay, so table element is, as you know, you can access it using the name of the element, which is table. And you also should know that within table there are elements called th and td. TD stands for a regular data cell and TH stands for a header cell, right? So I'm going to use those elements as well, TD, and I'm going to basically give it a border of 2 pixel solid, and let me say olive color border. Okay, and I'm going to let's see, I'm going to go to border. Let's see how it looks, right? When I refresh the page, and look, our entire table is now inside we have borders. We have borders for the entire table. We also have borders for the cells. Remember, the elements that I used here, th and td, they refer to the cells. So in other words, if I remove th and td, right, and I just give table, you will see that all the cell borders disappear when I refresh the page. Look, now you just have one big border around the whole table, right? I'm just doing this just to let you know that what are th and td. Obviously you can read up on it if you're not familiar with it, but they refer to the cells. th refers to the header cells and td refers to the data cells. Okay, so now when I put them back, you will see lines across each of the cells like so. All right, now what I would also like to do is increase the length of the table, right? And I also actually want to, before I do that, I want to give it some let me increase the length of the table here. All right, so I'm going to, in order to increase the length of the table, I'm going to access or select the table once again separately, because I'm only interested in increasing the width of the table. Excuse me, not the length, the width of the table. I am not interested in increasing the width of TH and TD, because that doesn't make sense. If you increase the width of the table, the width of TH and TD, the cells within the table, will also automatically increase. So I'm going to select just the table. I'm going to give it a width of, I don't know, let's say 65%, or let me do 60%. Okay, and let's see how it looks. So when I gave it a width of 60%, I expect this table to be wider. So let me refresh the page, and look, it is wider. All right, it is nice and wide. Now I want to do, what I don't like here is that I'm seeing the text in each of the cells is basically sticking to the left hand edge, the left hand border. I want to give it some padding. So let me do that. In order to, again, I will give the padding to the element, to the table, and also the TH and TDs. So I'll just say padding left is 1 rem, and let's see what I get, or what changes we see here. Okay, now look, all the text within the table cells is nicely centered away from both edges, away from both borders, right? So visibility has definitely improved. Previously, all the text here was basically sticking to the left edge of the table. This text here was sticking to the left edge of this cell, and basically all the text were flush, or basically right adjacent to the left edge of that particular cell, and was looking a bit awkward, or a bit, not as clean. And we have addressed that by applying some simple styling of padding, and now all the stuff is nicely placed center inside the table. All right, so we have addressed a lot of the styling changes that I needed, that I wanted to address. And as I said, when I finished styling, when we created the two elements, right, I had told you that when we start coding the logic using JavaScript jQuery, we may have to return back to styling that, right? This is what I had meant. So after I used, we programmatically rendered the stuff in the editor box and programmatically parsed it and rendered it here. We did a little bit of styling. We did a styling for the code block. We did styling for the block code. We did styling for the table. And now things are looking much better. Obviously, we did styling for the image, right? Made it smaller and applied this vertical scroll tag. So now our Markdown preview is looking even better. All right, but we're not done. There's still lots more coding to be done. So what is the other stuff? So let's start with the button, right? I would like the buttons basically to behave such that when you click on this button, right now nothing happens, right? When you click on this button, right, what should happen is that it should, it should expand. If you click on this button, the editor box should expand, and this button should disappear, and in its place should appear the other button. So let's code that first. So I'm going to go back to my script file. Okay. So the way I'm going to go about doing this is, I think a convenient way to do that would be to basically use a switch case statement. All right. So I'm going to basically the first of all, we have to attach a click element to the click event to the button, right? Remember, we are saying that when you click this button, something should happen. When you click the other button here, something should happen. And when you click the compress button, which becomes visible later, right, something should happen. So basically we are talking about something needs to happen when you click the buttons. So the first thing we got to do is we got to attach a click event to the button. So let's do that. I'm going to simply access the button, or select the button using the name of the HTML element, right? And I'm going to attach a click event. All right. I'm going to pass to it an anonymous function. And I'm going to open up the curly braces, and here is where I will write my click event handler for the buttons. All right. Now again, you should be familiar with this if you are, if you have somewhat of a working knowledge of jQuery and JavaScript. Okay. Now the first thing I want to do is, since I have used a generic button, I'm not selecting buttons individually by their ID. I could do that, right? I do have IDs for each of the buttons. I could do that, right? See, look, each button has its own ID. But doing that would mean that I would have a whole bunch of click events for each button, right? That would make the code more messy. So that is why I'm going with choosing all the buttons using the generic HTML name button, and once a button is clicked, the first thing I have to do is figure out, hey, which button was clicked. In other words, the first thing I have to do is get the ID of the button that was clicked. Because remember, a user can click only one button at a time, right? It is not possible to click more than one button at any one point in time. So whenever a user clicks a button, he or she is going to click only that particular button that he or she clicked on. So in other words, we at any point in time, there's only one button that is clicked. So as soon as the button is clicked, the first thing we have to do is get the ID of the button. You can do that by basically using a syntax, a method called, actually we have to pass an argument here since we're using button as a generic selector. We have to pass a, let me call it E, okay? And the way you select that is you basically do E dot current target dot ID, okay? This jQuery method, so basically you're passing, when you're passing to the function the object, this object contains the information about the button, right? This object has a method called current target, and that method has a has a ID. It returns the ID name. All right, so that's the basic synopsis of this line of code that I wrote, e.currentTarget.id. What I'm saying is that this will return the ID of the button that was clicked. All right, now clearly we have to store it, so we store it using a variable. So I'm going to declare a variable called btn id, and in here I'm going to store the ID of the button that was clicked. And how am I going to get the ID? I'm going to get the ID using this current target method. Okay, that and then selecting ID and giving it an ID, right? So this is a concatenated set of methods that will return to me ID of the button that was clicked, and that will get stored in this variable that we just created called button or btn ID. Okay, so now this line of code will give us the ID of the button that was clicked. Now, if you want to see that, let's do a quick console.log. Okay, and here I will just print the ID of the button. Okay, so let's see if it does it. So I'm going to go to my website. I'm on my page. I'm going to open up the console here. Keep an eye at the bottom of the page. Okay, the console is opening up. It should open up momentarily, and here it is. Now when I click this button, you should see the ID of this button printed in the console. So let's do it. And look, this button has an ID of e-exp. That's what got printed. Let me click the other button, the button on the previewer box. When I click this button, the ID of this button which should get printed, which should be p-exp. And look, p-p got printed. If I click again, it gets printed again. If I click this again, and you get the ID of this button, which is e-exp, printed again. So I did this quick experiment just to show you that our code is working. We are successfully retrieving the ID of the button that was clicked, and we are printing it. Now we don't need this console.log statement. I'm going to get rid of it. Now what we need to do, well, I'm going to use a switch statement to basically compare which button ID was clicked, and based on the ID of the button that was clicked, I'm going to basically expand that whole editor box or previewer box. That's what I'm going to do. So switch on button ID. Okay, I'm going to go try to move a little quicker here. Hopefully you are familiar with the switch case statement. This is some very boilerplate code. Now within the switch statement, I'm going to start writing the cases. The first case is when the button ID is e-exp. Okay, colon. Okay, I misspelled switch. It should be TCX. That's why I'm getting the weird underline under the word case. And here I'm going to write the code that I would like to happen when the button whose ID e-exp. So basically what I'm saying is that when the e-exp button is clicked, what do I need to happen? Well, first off, I need to make sure that that button gets hidden and the other button gets visible, right? So I'm just going to grab that button, which is so the button that gets pressed gets hidden, right, as soon as it gets pressed, right? So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to apply toggle class method, and I'm going to toggle class the class hide, because hide contains is our mechanism to hide a button, right? Because it has the property display. So this is the first thing I want to do, right? Whenever a button is clicked, the first thing should happen is that button should disappear and the other button, the compress button, should become visible, right? So I'll do this, and I will also now make the other button visible, which is e-com. I'll apply the toggle class method here as well. Okay, so this should make the other button visible. Okay, what else do I need to do? Well, when I do this, when I click the expand button, I want the text. I want the text area element, this whole box, to occupy the entire space, right? And I want the entire preview box to disappear. So I'm going to make the preview box disappear by just selecting the entire preview box, which is preview-pane, and apply toggle class hide. Okay, and then I'm going to also make the text area element much bigger, right? So, well, let's see what it does so far. All right, if I go here, if I refresh the page, and when I click this button, I should see something happen. Let's see what happens. All right, look what happened. The preview box disappeared, but nothing happened to this button, right? This button remained in its place. That's not appropriate, right? We want this button to disappear, and in its place we should see the compress button. Why did that not happen? So let's check it out here. Oh, that's because we did not select the ID. We forgot to add the hash sign. Remember, to select an element using ID, you have to use the hash sign. So that's the mistake we made, and that is why we didn't see that. So now if we go back here, and if I refresh the page, now when I click this button, I should see this guy, this whole box below, disappear. I should see this button disappear, and in its place I should see the compress button. And look, the previewer box disappeared, the expand button disappeared, and in its place I see the compress button. Obviously we will take care of this white background. It should not be the case, right? That's because the editor box is not occupying the length of the editor remain the same. We want to make sure that the length of the editor occupies the entire page, entire sort of the viewport, right? So we have to increase the number of rows of the text area element. That will ensure that this whole page gets occupied by the editor box. So we can do that by simply selecting the text area element. Okay, and I'm going to change the attribute, right? I'm going to change the attribute rows. So I'm going to select user attribute method, select rows, and give it a value of, I don't know, 40, let's say. Okay, now let's see if it does it. Refresh the page, click this button, and look, nice. We have successfully implemented the expanding of the editor box. When we click it, look again. Right now it's back to the normal state. When we click it, this button disappears, the compress button appears in its part, and the whole page is occupied by the editor box. That's exactly what we need. Now let's code the compress button. Okay, so again we'll do a switch case here. So let me get rid of these extra lines here. Okay, this was the, I'm going to move this. I'm going to move this here so it's easier to relate that this curly braces for this. I'm going to come here, and I'm going to do the other case E. Now I'm going to program when the button that has been clicked is the compress button. So I have to set the case, which is e-com. Okay, colon. Now what do I need to happen? Okay, well, pretty much the same thing, right? The first thing we need to happen is we want that compress button to disappear, right? So e-com should disappear. So toggle class hide. Okay, The next thing we want is we want the expand button to appear. Remember, we are now addressing or coding for the case when the user has clicked the compress button. So when the user clicks the compress button, we want what are the things we need to happen? We need the compress button to disappear, and in its place we want the expand button to show up. Okay, so I'm going to apply this, I'm just basically rewriting the same code here. And what do I need to happen? I also want the number, I also want the previewer box to show up, right, to its original size. So let me select the preview pane and toggle class. Okay, and now I'm going to also reduce the number of rows in the text area, right, because we want things to return back to its original size, right? So I'm going to use the attribute method on this and reduce the number of rows to, what did I have before? I think I had, let me check the HTML. Number of rows, I had it as 10. So let me return it back to 10. Okay. So now I think we have successfully written our previewer code. I'm sorry, not previewer code. We have successfully written the code to address what happens when the compress button is clicked. Let's test it out. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to refresh the page. Now everything's back to normal. Now we already tested that our expand buttons works properly. We click on it. Uh-oh, looks like something went wrong. Well, what went wrong? Let's do a quick check here. Oh, I used the expand button. I'm supposed to wait, no, that's fine. That should be the way it is. So why am I getting a weird error here? Okay. Okay, is it the name? Did I by mistake use a different, no, the ID name is e-com. That's what I have here. All right. Let's check the console. Whenever you have an issue where some code is not working, you should check the console and see if there is any errors. Okay, so there aren't any errors here either. Okay, so let's see now what's going on here. When I click here, nothing happens. Okay, well, just a moment ago things were happening, right? So obviously it has to do with the code that we just, oh, we did not include a break statement. A switch case syntax requires that you have a break here, so that is the problem. Otherwise all the code lines run successively. That's the problem, and now we should be good. So I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click here and look, the expand button is working properly. We tested that a few moments ago. Let's see if the compress button is working properly, and it does. Right? Look, when you click the expand button, the whole page gets occupied by the editor and its content, and when you the preview pane, the preview box completely disappears, and the expand button also disappears. And when you click the compress button, we get the desired behavior, which is that number one, the compress button should disappear, and in its place we should get the expand button, and the editor box should come back to its original dimension, and the previewer box should also come back and become visible, right? So when I press the compress button, look, here's the previewer box in its original dimension with everything intact. The compress button has disappeared and the expand button has appeared. All right, so we have successfully coded the expand compress for the editor box. Let's now do the same for the previewer box, and here we should be able to reuse a lot of the code. So I'm going to keep going here. The next thing I want to code is the next case is case where the ID is p-exp, meaning the user has clicked the expand button in the previewer box. Okay, so I'm going to open this up, curly braces. So what do I need to happen first? I basically need the p-exp to disappear. So toggle class hide. Okay, I want the compress button to appear. Okay, all right. And what else do I need to happen? I also need the editor box to completely disappear. So I'm going to select the entire editor box, which is the article element whose ID is editor pane, editor dash pane, excuse me. And I'm going to toggle class with the height class onto it. And I would like the, well, let's see if, what we get here, right? So I have basically now coded, what I've done is I've coded when the expand button, for the previewer box is pressed by the user. All right, so that's what I have done here. So let's go back to our web page and refresh the page. Right, let's see what happens when I click this. All right, pretty good. That's what we wanted, right? Right, that's the behavior, that's exactly the behavior we needed. That when you click the expand button, right, let me do it again, right? When I click the expand button of the previewer pane, what should happen? Well, first off, the editor pane should completely disappear. Number two, the previewer pane should occupy the full web page, the full length of the web page. Number three, the expand button should disappear and the compress button should appear. And all four things are happening. Look here, boom. The expand button disappeared and in its place you have the compress button. The previewer pane is occupying the full length of the page, and the editor pane is completely gone. Now obviously we haven't coded for this, so nothing will happen, right, but we'll code it now. All right, so let me put it back to its original state. And let's quickly code the final part, which is I'm just going to do this. I'm going to put a break here. Obviously, we need to do that. Okay. Now, the final case that we have to code for is case when the user has clicked the compress button in the previewer box. So we know the ID for the compress button in the previewer box is p-com. So that's the case we'll have to match with. I'll open up the curly braces here to write our code. And in here, I can basically, copy all this, right? I don't need to type it. Save myself some time. Okay. Let's just double check to make sure. Yep. So when you click the compress button, we toggle both the buttons. So that's good. The editor pane also gets toggled. That is good. And yeah, I think that should be enough. Let's check it out. Refresh the page. Let me click this button. Okay, good. That's what we need. Now let's click the compress button. And yep, it's working just perfectly. Right, so now all four button behaviors have been successfully coded, right? Once again, when I click the expand button of the editor box expands and occupies the whole web page. The previewer box disappears. The expand button in the editor disappears, and we get the compress button. When I click the compress button, everything returns back to normal, right? Same thing with the previewer box. When I click the expand button of the previewer pane, the previewer pane occupies the whole height of the web page and more. Editor box disappears completely. The expand button of the previewer disappears, and in its place appears the compress button, right? And when I click the compress button, everything comes back to normal. All right, so hope you are feeling good about the progress we're making. Things are moving in the right direction. So we have coded the expand and compress button, among other things, right? What else do we need to code? Well, if you look at the requirement, it also states that whenever you type in the Markdown previewer, right? Whenever you type in the Markdown preview, right? When I enter text into the editor element, the preview element is updated as I type to display the content of the text area. So what it is saying is that, as I showed you before, right? If you type something here, this is not the code that we just wrote. This is not the app that we are coding. This is the previous version that I used to demonstrate how it works. If I code something here with a hash followed by this is h1 tag. Look, as I was typing, it was also typing it here. So we need that behavior in the app we are coding. Right now we don't have it. So right now, for example, if you go here, if I say this is some text. If I say this is some text, do you see something here? You don't see anything here, right? You don't see that, right? So we have to clearly work on that. Okay, so let's do that now. All right, one quick thing I noticed, the word previewer is going to the next line. That's not proper. I'd like to see it in the same line. So let me reduce the margin. Let me reduce the padding. I think I gave too much padding to the preview element. Let me quickly reduce that so the preview stays, the whole first heading stays in the first line itself, right? So our preview, where is our preview? Let me find the preview element. I gave it a padding of 2.7. That's a bit much. Let me give it 2.5. Go back here. What I'm expecting is the previewer should go back to this line. Okay, let's see that. And it does. And that's exactly what I wanted, right? We would like each sentence, each of the headings to remain in its own line. That just looks cleaner. Okay, so that was saying, right, when we type something here, nothing shows up in the preview box. But the requirements in the project expects that whenever we type here, let's say we type some random text, right? That text should show up here. But if we type some markdown, some valid markdown, that should get appropriately converted, parsed by the parser, which is in the back end of our app, and it should get rendered. The appropriate HTML element should get rendered. Again, I discussed this in detail when I was doing the walkthrough of the mockup, the walkthrough of the other version of the app. So it should be clear to you. If you're not clear what I mean, please go back to that part of the video to refresh. But we basically have to build in code so that every time we type something here, it should appear here simultaneously. If we type some valid markdown, the appropriate HTML element should convert here. So let's do that now. All right, so let me go back into my VS Code and let me go to, all right, so I want to basically here, whenever I type in the text area, I should see something in the preview element. That's the basic idea, right? A good way to do that is to use the keyup function. So jQuery has a keyup function, which basically is an event or a keyup event, right? This keyup event is basically this keyup event, basically what it does is that every time you click a character, every time you click a key, excuse me, not a character, every time you click on a key, right, it should as soon as you release the key, the character that key represents gets stored, right? That character gets stored in the keyup function, and it basically then holds it, and then you can hold that or use that character that is stored and basically display it wherever you want. Okay, that's just a really approximate summary of the keyup function. I'm sure if you read the formal documentation on the keyup function, the jQuery keyup function, it'll be much clearer. But let's see if you understand it better when I actually code it. So as I said, I'm going to basically say that what I'm trying to do is that, hey, I'm going to attach to our text area, right? What we need to happen here is that whenever a user types something in the text area box, it should appear simultaneously here, right? So the way to do that would be to use a keyup function or to attach a keyup event to the text area. So I'm going to grab the text area with this ID. The ID is editor, as you know. I'm going to attach a keyup event to this. Okay, I'm going to pass to it an anonymous function. Okay, and I'm going to now write the code that will make sure that every time a key is pressed, while inside the text area, if a key is pressed, that character gets translated and gets moved and gets rendered in the preview element, right? So first we have to store that character that is represented by the keys that was pressed, right? So I'm going to create a variable, let's say TMP, and in this variable TMP, I'm going to store the character that is represented by the key that the user has pressed. The way to do that is you simply say, you can use the this, the this reference, and you can use the val method, right? Again, this is standard jQuery. What this does is, let me fix this, it should be smaller case L. What this line of code does is that, well, this line of code, what it does is that it says whatever key, this refers to whichever key that was pressed. Get the value of that key, meaning whatever is the character value of that key, and hold it and assign it to this variable. That is what is being done by this line of code. Okay, once again, this reference is saying, hey, whichever key that was pressed, get me the value of that key and store it in this variable TMP. That's all. Okay, so now TMP holds the key, the character that is represented in the key that was pressed. Well, now we have to parse it, right? Remember, we're not simply putting or rendering characters without parsing it, right? We have to first make sure that if the character that was pressed is a valid markdown, it gets parsed, right? So that's why we have to parse the content. How do we parse it? We know how to parse it. We'll just create another variable. Let's say variable, say called let parse text. Okay, and I'm going to store in this variable marked.parse TMP. Again, this is exactly what we did before. In order to parse if you have a string variable, if you want it to be parsed by the marked parser, you simply call marked.parse and pass it as an argument the name of the variable. So we did it ahead, so hopefully this is clear to you. And now we have to render it. To render it in the preview element, we'll grab the preview element with this ID, and we will, since we know that whenever the marked parser parses any text, it renders HTML. So we have to use the HTML method and pass to it the variable parse text. Okay, and now with this few lines of code, we should be able to accomplish and see that whenever we type in this text area, it should get simultaneously rendered here. Let's see if it does. Refresh the page. So I'm going to type here just some random text without any markdown. I'm going to say this is some random text. And look, as I was typing, hopefully you noticed it was getting rendered here simultaneously, right? And I am typing some more random text. Look, as I was typing, it was getting rendered here simultaneously. Now, the exact same thing is getting rendered here. Why? Because I have not put any markdown here. Let's now try the experiment, test it out by putting some valid markdown. So I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, let me get rid of this here. I don't know why it went to the other line. Let me get rid of this here. Okay. I'm going to now put some markdown. So I'm going to use the hash sign, which we know has a special meaning in the markdown language, right? So hash sign means heading 1. So I'm going to say hash space, this is an h1 tag. And look here now, what happened? We got an h1, we got the text printed and rendered as an h1 tag. All right, so well guys, our marked parser is now working well. It is now actually, whenever you type in the text area, if you type random text, it gets rendered as the random text, meaning if you type non-markdown text, it gets rendered as non-markdown text. And if you happen to type markdown syntax, it gets converted to the appropriate HTML element. Let's try one more. Let's do double hash. This is an h2 tag. And look, we got, not only did it render simultaneously, it rendered the appropriate HTML element because we used double hash, and we know in Markdown, double hash is a special meaning. It means heading 2. It means an heading 2 element, and that's exactly what we got. And if you want to compare, look at the size. H1 is supposed to be bigger than H2, and that's what we have. So we know that our Markdown previewer is working, and we are using the marked parser correctly. So let me now get rid of these two because we don't need it. All right, so this is great. All right, So we are pretty much done here, guys, with our coding. We just have one more thing I want to bring your memory to. I want to bring your attention to, focus your attention to. Look here, look at this bonus. Look at this bonus thing. All right. And I told you when I read the bonus requirement that I'm going to actually try to code it, right? So let's try to code it, right? The bonus requirement basically says that whenever your Markdown previewer should be able to interpret a carriage return and render them as a break element, right? And it says and how do we do that, right? We can go to the marked documentation to find out how to do that. So you go to the mark.js.org landing page and you click on the options here, and it will bring you to this page, and this is where you will get the directions or the hint as to how to implement that bonus requirement. Again, this is the bonus requirement that we're trying to implement, which is that when we type a carriage return in the text area element, it should get converted as a HTML element of BR and get rendered in the preview element. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the marked documentation and look what it says here, right? If in order for you to get a carriage return converted to a BR element, what do you need to do? You have to set the breaks flag to true, right? Now, obviously, I've read this before, so I know where to go. If you're not familiar with this page, take the time to read it. You will benefit from it, especially if you're a developer, right? So hope you know, but again, I've done it, so I know exactly where to look. So basically, there's a method here, set options. You have to use this method and you have to set this flag to true. Right now it is set to false. So if we put a carriage return, it will not get converted to anything, right? If I go to the page here and if I put a carriage return, right, it's not going to get converted to a BR element, right? Look here, there's no distance that happens below. Okay, so now let's implement that bonus requirement. And again, all I have to do is I have to apply this method set options to the marked parser, and I have to set the break flag to true. That's it. Don't worry about all this. This is stuff that is related to something else. It is not related to any of the requirements we need to implement. It is not related to that. It is related to totally something else, so we can just comment it out. But we need to use the set options method to basically set the breaks flag to true, and that's all we need to do. If we do that, we should be able to meet or implement this bonus requirement of carriage return, right? So let's do that. So I'm going to basically copy this whole thing. Okay, I'm going to copy this whole thing here. I'm going to bring it to my script, my JavaScript file. Now, where do we position it? Remember, what are we trying to do? We are now changing some of the configuration of the marked parser, right? If you read the documentation, you will realize that the set options method allows you to change some of the configuration of the marked parser. So just to be safe, you should run this code right at the very beginning of your jQuery file, so that every time you use marked parser, it basically uses this updated configuration, right? So that is why we are going to put this right at top. I'm going to basically paste it up right up here. As I said, I don't need this stuff, so I'm just going to comment it out. Sorry, I didn't comment it out. I just okay, this is me commenting this. This is the probability commented out. Okay, and all I have to do is change this flag to true. All right, and now with this, our requirement is met. Right now, it may not exactly be visible here. I'm not sure if it's visible here or not. Okay, but it will pass the test, right? If you don't do that, it would have not passed the test, right? So we will check it out when we run the next step, which is running automated tests. In other words, guys, we have completely coded our Markdown previewer, right? So once again, our Markdown previewer does everything. It loads. When it loads, it has some default Markdown text in the text area element, and it has the corresponding HTML stuff rendered correctly in the preview element. Okay, it has also ability to type. So when you type something here, h1 tag, it renders correctly. So that core central requirement is also met. Plus, we have also coded these button functionality, right? When we click on the button, the appropriate behavior happens. So we have successfully coded our Markdown previewer. So let's now move to the next step, which is running automated tests. So to run automated tests, right, this is the page that the FREECODECAMP provides where they have the automated tests. So I'm basically going to clean this comments out, and I'm going to bring over my code. So right, bring over my code here. Okay, let's see here. What I'm going to do is, let me change this a little bit. I'm going to close this, and let me see if I can open this up here. I might need to open this up once again. Okay, let's see. All right, so I am now, I just had to log in because my session had expired, as you saw. So now I am back onto the coding space on codepane.io, where I can basically run the automated tests. Okay, so let me first port over my code here into the space. So I'm going to basically, okay, select this and bring it over here. Okay, I'm going to now, let me bring over my CSS. Bring over my CSS, and finally let me bring over my JavaScript code here. Okay, now as you can see, the previewer and because we have loaded all our code here into the codepane.io space, our parser is visible exactly as it's supposed to be. Okay, now let me just quickly save this just to be sure, and let me pick the right suite of tests here, Markdown preview, and let's run it. Now if the tests pass, I think there are about 8 or 9 tests, it should show a green sign here. And voila, you got it, guys. All 8 tests passed. If you want to see what tests passed, you just open this up. You will see the testing, all the tests listed here. See, we're passing all the tests, right? We have an element with ID as editor. It's a text area element, right? So basically, this lists all the requirements. There were 7 requirements that we read, and because we successfully met all the requirements, all 7 automated tests are passing. All right, or actually 8 automated tests are passing, right? So we have all the tests that are passing. Okay, very good. So we have successfully coded this, guys. Our Markdown previewer project is officially completed. Now let's quickly basically do the final thing, which is I'm going to take you to my GitHub page, and you can, so you know where the coding artifacts are. So, and before I do that, guys, if you liked the detailed, organized approach where, in which I've tried to, convey how to code and in which I basically built this project and my other projects, please do give me a like and also subscribe. I do take extra effort to convey the thinking behind development. I don't want to just basically do a quick coding session, because if I did that right, you may learn something, but you may still not be able to pick up what I feel is very important, which is to learn the thought process of a developer. So that's why I go into a lot of commentary, because my goal is to expose to you, to basically make you familiar with, how to go about the thought process, the decision-making process whenever you're coding, right? So if you like that, please do subscribe and give me a like. And let's move on to the final step, which is I will take you to my GitHub page. Okay, let me where is it here? And there it is. Okay, so this is the GitHub page, guys. All right, if you can, I will give a link to this. If you come here, pretty straight up, hopefully you are familiar with GitHub. I have created a repository. It's called Markdown_previewer_solution1, and all the code is going to be here, right? That's pretty much it, right? You can click on it whenever you feel like, when you have time. This is recently created. I have placed the index.html file here, the script, the styles file here, the script.js file here, and in the assets folder, I have placed the requirements and also the mockup screenshots, right? So that way, whenever you come here, if you don't have access to the FREECODECAMP page, you can still come here and view and read the requirements, take a look at the mockup, and then obviously have access to all the coding artifacts, the HTML file, the CSS file, and the JavaScript file. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it for this video. And thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you liked and learned something from this.